The shriek tore through the drywall, a sound born of agony and something ancient, something that peeled back the thin veneer of normalcy. My hands were already at my old wristwatch, fingers tracing the cool metal, a nervous tic I'd cultivated over too many sleepless nights and too many close calls. This wasn't just a domestic squabble spiraling out of control. The glass splintered, not in the apartment across the hall, but inside her head. I saw the shadow, the impossible growth pushing through bone, felt the psychic crackle in the air, and witnessed the horrifying shift from terror to something far, far worse. It had all started, as these things always did, with a bad decision dressed up as a temporary job. A way to keep moving, to keep the past just out of reach. Another city, another dead-end night shift, another layer of grime on the soul. This time, it was a low-paying security gig for a dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of what passed for a thriving metropolis these days, the kind of place where the silence was always pregnant with unseen things, where the air hung heavy with the residue of countless lives lived in quiet desperation, and where the peeling paint felt less like neglect and more like an insidious disease. I'd taken the job because it was late nights, minimal interaction, and it paid cash. The perfect setup for a ghost like me. I remember my first round on the third floor, the scuff of my worn work boots on the stained carpet. The stale smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the lingering aroma of cheap microwave dinners and desperation. I was checking locks, making sure no enterprising junkie had found a new way into the laundry room. When I first heard them, voices, a man and a woman, from apartment 3B. Arguments weren't unusual in places like this, par for the course. But these voices, even muffled by a few inches of plaster and a thin door, carried an unnatural edge. The woman's voice was too soft, too pleading, and the man's, a deep baritone, occasionally fractured into something else entirely. A low growl, a guttural snarl that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I chalked it up to a bad temper, maybe a few too many beers, and kept moving. My job was to keep the residents from killing each other in the hallways, not to play marriage counselor through the walls. My conscience, a rusty, seldom used tool, remained stubbornly sheathed. A week passed. The late shift was mind-numbingly dull. My only companions were the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallways, the occasional squeak of a rat in the walls, and the ever-present low hum of the building's decaying infrastructure. I'd lean against the wall in a forgotten corner, scrolling through blurry photos of dilapidated motels on my phone, already planning my next escape. Just 2 more weeks, I told myself. Just enough to fill the gas tank and stock up on enough instant coffee to keep the world at bay for another 1,000 miles. Then I was gone, another city wiped clean from my internal map. But the voices from 3B continued their nightly ritual. Not every night, but enough for me to notice. Enough for me to subconsciously alter my patrol route. Lingering a little longer on the 3rd floor, my head tilted just so, trying to discern the nuances of the domestic drama unfolding within. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. More like the hyper-vigilance of a veteran soldier hearing distant gunfire. You don't want to get involved, but you also need to know if it's coming your way. My watch, my old analog friend, seemed heavier those nights, its ticking a stark reminder of the slow, grinding march of time. One evening, I heard a crash. The sound of breaking glass, sharp and violent, sliced through the usual hum of the building. My stomach twisted. "Don't get involved, Vance. It's not your fight." My usual mantra. But then the woman's cry, a raw, choked sob, followed by a voice, the man's, that had completely lost its human cadence. It was deeper, rougher, like rocks grinding together, laced with a venom that wasn't just anger, it was hate. A primal, consuming hate that felt older than the building, older than the city, older than me. It reminded me, vaguely, of another sound I'd heard, a whisper in a snow-choked mountain pass. Too cold, too close, from a phantom that shouldn't have been there. A shiver, colder than any winter wind, traced a path down my spine. My reluctant conscience, that festering wound in my soul, chose that moment to act up. It screamed at me. Someone is in pain. Someone needs help. I hated that voice. I'd learned, the hard way, that helping rarely ended well for Leo Vance. It just meant more scars, more trauma to add to the growing pile in my head. But the scream, it was too much. It clawed at something deep inside me, something I usually kept buried under layers of cynicism and self-preservation. Maybe it was the memory of a past failure, a person I couldn't save, a fire I couldn't stop. The details were still fuzzy, locked behind a mental block, but the feeling lingered, a constant, dull ache of guilt. I found myself outside apartment 3B. My hand hovered over the door, knuckles brushing the cold metal of the handle. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drum solo of dread. The cheap wood of the door felt thin, fragile, barely a barrier. I could hear the man's voice, now a full-blown roar, punctuated by the woman's whimpers. "You think you're lonely?" he snarled, the voice somehow louder, clearer, despite the barrier. Then another crash, a heavier sound this time, something solid hitting a wall. "You know what, bitch?" My breath hitched. This wasn't just an argument, this was a demolition. And the voice, it was wrong. Too much bass, too much raw, unadulterated aggression. It wasn't just a man yelling. It was something else speaking through him. I'd seen it before, or something like it. Not like this, not exactly, but enough to know the chilling difference between human rage and something far, far worse, like the way Ethan's eyes had gone utterly dead before he started carving, or Olivia's unsettling stillness before her true nature unraveled. My internal monologue, usually so quick with a sarcastic quip, was silent, replaced by a cold dread that numbed my extremities. Your company is far from satisfying. What with your stupid goddamn rants about inequality, this injustice, that, the voice mocked, shifting now, strangely, into a patronizingly high-pitched, whining tone. It was a grotesque mimicry designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. You ever stop and think you're just making all that shit up? Or maybe things are the way they are for a reason, to keep you safe? My hand was still on the doorknob, but I didn't turn it. I couldn't. Not yet. I was a man who'd seen things that didn't fit into any sane worldview. But even I hesitated. This wasn't just a threat. It was a psychological attack, a dismantling of someone's reality. It felt intimate, violating. The woman's gasps were growing more frantic, choked, as if she were trying to hold back something enormous, something on the verge of erupting. Just how many times do I have to tell you this until it gets through your thick, fat skull? He is not your friend. The voice seethed, its words sharp as daggers, radiating a palpable sense of possession, of absolute control. All he wants from you is what every man wants from every woman, and what he wants is mine. That last word, mine, was delivered with a possessiveness that chilled me to the bone. And then, a new sound. A wet, sickening squelch. Not the sound of a fist, or a body hitting a wall. It was something internal, something organic, a sound that made my stomach lurch. And with it, a faint, nauseating odor began to seep from under the door. Not human waste, not garbage. Something older, like a cellar that had been locked for centuries, filled with damp earth and something that had rotted and festered beneath it. The smell of decay, of slow, creeping corruption. My hand flew to my mouth instinctively to ward off the stench. I heard the woman's muffled yelp of pain, sharp and immediate. "What the fuck?" Her voice, though still choked, had changed. It had a new edge, a new resonance. And then, the male voice, the demon's voice, colder, more clinical. even as it was laced with a cruel satisfaction. What the fuck is wrong with you? That was it. The line. My reluctant conscience, having dragged me this far, finally shoved me over the edge. No more. This was beyond domestic dispute. This was something inhuman, preying on the vulnerable, and my soul, as scarred as it was, couldn't stand by. I didn't care about the consequences, about the fresh trauma. I couldn't just walk away and let whatever that thing was finish its work. Not after all I'd seen, all I'd barely survived. I gripped the doorknob. It was cold, slimy almost, though I knew it was just my clammy hand. I twisted it. The lock clicked with surprising ease. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a scene that solidified every horror I had ever witnessed, every nightmare that had ever clawed its way from my subconscious into the waking world. The apartment was a wreck. A glass lay shattered against one wall, sparkling shards scattered like malevolent diamonds on the worn carpet. A framed photograph, likely of the couple, lay face down near the doorway, its glass cover splintered. The air was thick with the cloying, putrid scent I detected, now stronger, tinged with something metallic, coppery, blood, and there they were. Daniel, the man, stood by the far wall, his face a mask of shock, eyes wide, mouth agape, seemingly transfixed by the woman on the floor. She was huddled against the base of the sofa, knees pulled tight to her chest, trembling, but it wasn't just fear that racked her. Her hands were pressed against her forehead, and between her fingers, I could see two dark, gnarled protrusions, like black branches tearing through skin. They were horns, raw, bleeding, utterly impossible. And then I saw her fingernails, elongated, yellowed, morphing into wicked claws before my very eyes. Her eyes, fixed on her transformed hands, were no longer the soft, muted color I'd imagined. They were wide, vacant, and unsettlingly white. The man, Daniel, finally stirred, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Love, what's happened to you?" And then the woman, the victim, unleashed it. Her body convulsed, a wave of raw, burning rage washing over her. The sound that ripped from her throat was not human. It was a primordial shriek, a blaring, guttural roar that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The framed photographs on the wall, already trembling, rattled violently, and one, already cracked, exploded outward, showering the room with splinters of glass. "What the fuck is wrong with me?" she screamed, her voice deepening, becoming monstrous, yet still laced with a horrifying anguish. Her entire skull seemed to contort, a fresh, sickening tearing sound accompanying the visible ripping of flesh around the base of the horns. What the fuck is wrong with me?" It was a revelation, delivered with the force of a physical blow. The demon hadn't just possessed Daniel, it had created one in her, or awakened it, or perhaps it had simply been transferred. The implications made my blood run cold. Daniel, the supposed host, the one who was supposed to be the monster, recoiled, stumbling backwards, genuine terror etched on his features. He was no longer possessed, he was just a man, witnessing the horrifying transformation of the woman he claimed to love. The woman's new monstrous face turned towards me, her eyes, those vacant white orbs, locking onto mine. A flicker of something ancient and terrible burned in their depths, something that recognized me, perhaps, as another vessel of trauma, another magnet for the darkness that permeated this world. I felt a cold surge of understanding, of shared fate. "Fuck you, you fucking fuck," she yelled, her voice a chorus of pure fury and deep, shattering pain. "Just shut up, please." And then, as suddenly as it had erupted, the rage in her seemed to coil back. The horns, still black and gnarled, twisted inward, seeming to retract, though the fresh wounds continued to ooze. Her claws seemed to shrink. Her eyes flickered with a returning, agonizing humanity. Still white, still vacant, but no longer radiating primal fury. She collapsed onto the floor, a heap of human misery. Daniel, cautious, almost hesitant, crept towards her, perching on the edge of the mattress. His voice was soft, almost soothing, a deceptive lullaby that made my stomach churn. "No, love, you aren't a monster. You are strong, but you are damaged." His eyes, however, held a flicker of something unreadable, something calculating beneath the veneer of concern. "It looks like you have a demon, too. Probably put inside you by one of those guys with their bad intentions." He sighed, pushing her bangs back, a disturbingly intimate gesture. "It's fate, love, for us to be together. I will fix you, and I will protect you from the demon inside of you. I'm the only one who understands what it's like to have one, so only I can save you from it, save you from yourself." I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my go bag slung over my shoulder, my hand still gripping the cool metal of my wristwatch, turning the crown aimlessly. The stench of rot still hung heavy in the air. The shattered glass glittered, and the words, Daniel's words, echoed in the apartment, a twisted sermon of control and manipulation. My initial surge of reluctant conscience had propelled me here, had forced me to witness this sickening display. Now, it was replaced by something far more cynical, far more weary. This wasn't just a demonic possession. This was a psychological battlefield, a twisted form of abuse cloaked in supernatural horror. Daniel wasn't just a victim. He was a manipulator, perhaps a true monster, exploiting the very real demonic presence to further his control, to convince her that she was broken and only he could fix her. He had offered her a sick parody of salvation, chaining her to him with invisible binds, far stronger than any physical restraint. And she, the victim, was now just another link in the chain, another monster in the making. The realization settled heavy in my gut. My life, my curse, had led me to witness yet another horror, another facet of the endless darkness that clung to the edges of humanity. The things I'd seen on the road, the phantom hitchhiker, Ethan's depravity, Olivia's skin collection, they were all different notes in the same terrifying symphony. People turning into monsters, or revealing the monsters that had always been lurking beneath the skin. And often, it was the normal ones, the quiet ones, the ones offering love and protection, who were the most insidious. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. I'd seen enough. My job here wasn't to intervene, not truly. It was to witness, to observe, to add another layer to the trauma that defined my existence. My fatal flaw, my reluctant conscience had gotten me in, and now my instinct for survival, honed by years of running, was screaming at me to get out. My hand tightened on my watch, the cold metal a small anchor point in the churning chaos. I turned slowly, my boots crunching softly on the glass shards near the door. I didn't look back at them, at the broken woman and the smiling devil in human skin. The air in the hallway felt suddenly lighter, cleaner, though I knew it was an illusion. The stench of rot, the echo of the screams, the image of those black, gnarled horns erupting from a human skull. They were already etched onto the walls of my mind. Another permanent fixture in the Leo Vance Chronicles. Just another ghost to keep me company on the lonely road ahead. I closed the door to apartment 3B, a quiet click that sealed away a fresh hell. My work shift wasn't over, but I knew I'd be gone by dawn. This city, like all the others, had just become too loud, too heavy, too much like home. Character count 9,876. The taste of dust and copper, the lingering scent of ozone, and something far, far older than rot. It's a phantom echo on my tongue even now. Decades later, it wasn't a dream, not a nightmare, but the very first memory I truly owned. I saw it through a pinhole, a 7-year-old's eye peering from the darkness of a cramped hiding place. watching a monster writhe. Renan Shinan, the self-proclaimed headmaster, a man who believed himself a god of stolen time, gurgled his final, disgusting breath. Spasms, violent and uncontrolled, racked his massive body, already a mottled canvas of angry welts and black, seeping puncture wounds. The scuttling horror of the Black Widows, my silent, venomous gladiators, was finishing what years of deprivation and terror had begun. His eyes, already swelling shut, were locked in a grotesque mask of surprise and disbelief. He'd seen my face, a small, pale ghost peering down from the hole in the ceiling. And in that moment, he'd known. He'd known that even without free will, a choice had been made. And then, silence. Just the frantic tap-tapping of tiny arachnid feet receding into the cracks of the floorboards, leaving behind only the fading, putrid tang of a dying god. It all started in a place that called itself a farm, though there was nothing pastoral about it. A crumbling wooden compound fenced by tall barbed wire, surrounded by an endless, unforgiving wilderness. A place where my memory began, etched not in sunshine and laughter, but in the sterile scrawl of a single, damning truth. There is no free will. Those words, stark black paint on a warped wooden sign, were the first things I learned to read. They hung above the opposite row of bunks in the sleeping barn, a constant, sneering reminder of our collective insignificance. I had no memories from before this desolate stretch of land, no echoes of a family, a home, a name. I just was waking each day to the cold, hard floor and the perpetual gnawing in my stomach. The others were the same. We were a flock of forgotten children, some aging, some inexplicably not, all equally devoid of pasts. Memory is a funny thing, or maybe it's a cruel joke. The brain, I've heard, is supposed to shield you from too much horror, to filter out the stuff that would snap your mind like a dry twig. But for me, it's always been the opposite. My brain is a sponge for the grotesque, soaking up every agonizing detail and replaying it on an endless loop. And this farm, this was where the loop began, a foundational trauma, a blueprint for every bad thing that would come after. It wasn't just a place, it was a factory for nightmares, and I was one of its products. We were always agonizingly hungry. 3 meager meals a day, if you could call them that. Before each serving, Headmaster Renan Shinan, a man whose voice scraped like rusty hinges and whose breath smelled of stale blood and old dust, would conduct his macabre ritual. He'd stand over a common trough, a glint in his cold, reptilian eyes, and sprinkle a few drops of clear liquid from a labelless brown bottle onto the food. Then, he'd serve behind a steel door, sliding out each plate through a small, grimy window. You never knew if your meal was poisoned. The air would thicken with a silent, desperate tension. Most of them, pale and skeletal, would dance around the edges of our plates, pushing a single grain of rice, sniffing the watery broth. No one was eager to dive in. Not after seeing a dozen kids turn blue and die right in front of us, collapsing in silent, spasmodic agony after picking the wrong, or perhaps the right meal. I never ate from my plate. Call it instinct, call it pure, desperate paranoia, but a deep, churning dread always kept my hand from reaching. Instead, I'd scavenge. The garbage pile behind the kitchen was my feast, a treasure trove of moldy crusts, discarded bones, anything that hadn't touched the poisoned plates. I became a connoisseur of the forgotten, the overlooked, 4 crows, picked clean and dry, found their way into my mouth over the years. I went full Renfield, a grimy, feral thing, eating flies, ants, dandelions, cockroaches, clovers, pillbugs, anything living and somewhat edible. I kept the spiders, though, black widows, specifically. They had a special place, a secret horde, a hunger for survival. So primal it bordered on monstrous, had been hammered into me. My old analog wristwatch, The one I absent-mindedly check now, even when I don't care about the time, is a modern affectation. Back then, time meant nothing. Only the next scrap, the next hidden breath, the next escape from Xenon's omnipresent terror. The 20 boys and 30-odd girls were the farm's workforce. We toiled in the fields from sunup to sundown, our small, brittle bodies providing all the food for this crumbling compound. There were no spotlights, no overt guards, yet the farm was far more inescapable than any prison. Every few weeks, Xenon would herd the nearly 100 of us to the edge of his property, to a desolate patch near the rusted barbed wire. There, he would blow a strange brass whistle, and from the underbrush, as if conjured from the very earth, bloodshot German shepherds would spring, their mouths foamed, their teeth gnashed on the wire, threatening to break through and tear us apart. Xenon would smile, a cold, predatory curve of his lips, and his voice, sounding like gunshots fired far away, would boom, "Their old guard dogs gone rabid. I have learned, through one of you, how to train them so they only obey me, and if you run, they will kill you, or make you wish you stayed here with me." The farm never offered answers. Only the hum of fear and the rasp of our own ragged breaths. Very few outsiders ever came. The rare, dented delivery trucks, a single grim prison bus that I never saw anyone leave or enter, and, most terrifyingly, a black, tinted window Thunderbird. That car didn't just drive, it roared. A deep, powerful turbine sound, as if rocket engines were installed under the hood. It dealt only with the headmaster, and only one person ever left with the driver of that car, a child, picked from our ranks, their eyes wide and vacant as they disappeared into the darkness of the luxury vehicle. A rumor, whispered in hushed, terrified tones, circulated among us. We weren't real kids at all. Headmaster Xenon, some said, was a demon crafting us from blood and ash. We never dared speak to him, never dared ask a question. A question meant a touch from his hard, cruel hand, a hand that made the surrounding air a pincushion of pain. The sting would lash at your skin even if his fingers merely grazed yours. It was a tangible, invisible assault, a psychic burn that left no marks, only searing agony. But above the poisonings, the back-breaking labor, the desperate scavenging, and the gnawing uncertainty of each day, we feared the nights worst of all. Being exhausted from working in the fields all day wasn't enough to overcome the primal terror that kept us awake. When it was darkest, when the air fell still and cold in the drafty barn, we would hear the headmaster's creaking footsteps. They didn't approach from outside. They would simply appear in the center of the barn, on the roof, scuttling up the walls, across the ceiling. I can still hear his breathing if I close my eyes. That sick pig's wheezing, agonized rasp, sucking air in and out in a guttural exhaust. The breathing and the footsteps would circle and circle, a predator's endless patrol, until he heard someone cry out, a whimper of terror, a sob of exhaustion. That's when the taken would give one last, choked cry before they were gone. Along with the headmaster, the missing child would return to their beds in the morning, always bearing new marks. A glancing finger left a nasty red and purple smear on a rib cage. Sometimes black, ink-like fingertips dotted their bodies, as if a charred hand had pressed down. We never spoke of these marks, never even glanced at them too long. We were always afraid the headmaster would hear and give us matching marks, or worse, marks from his boots. Sometimes he would touch you with his entire palm, leaving an invisible, wrinkled imprint, as raw and painful as a hot iron brand. I had a few of those marks myself, phantom pains that would flare up years later, sometimes in the middle of a peaceful night, reminding me of that unbearable farm. But even then, amidst the constant terror, I considered myself lucky. I had only a few marks, as far as I could tell. It was a small mercy in a life devoid of them. I was one of 4 boys and 5 girls chosen for house duty, We cleaned the headmaster's home, the farmhouse itself. I drew the short straw most days and cleaned the bathrooms, emptying out the shit cisterns with a slop bucket and rope. The stench was beyond description, a visceral, gagging horror that lingered in your nostrils for hours. It was while scrubbing for mildew, standing on the windowsill to reach a particularly stubborn patch, that I found them, a few loose ceiling boards directly above his toilet. They were almost imperceptible, camouflaged by dust and neglect. A tiny flicker of an idea sparked in my starved, terrified brain. This was my life for what felt like endless years. I swore I could have named 25 separate times the frost came, marking the passage of winters, but we had no way of keeping track of time, not even by our own apparent ages. Sometimes I swore I'd see a kid go from looking 13 or 14 back down to looking half that. Time made no sense at the farm. It flowed like a broken tap, sometimes rushing, sometimes freezing, sometimes reversing. I knew then, with a chilling certainty, that I wasn't going to get out by waiting. My future, whatever it was, wasn't going to be handed to me. It would have to be clawed from the jaws of Zinon's cruelty. One morning, I woke to a searing, hot pain on my upper arm. A vivid, angry red handprint burned into my flesh, precisely where Headmaster Ranon Sinon had brushed against me the previous day. It was deep, almost to the bone, and throbbed with a pain that transcended the physical. It wasn't a casual touch. It was a brand, a possessive mark, and in that moment, a hazy, starvation-induced plan, one that had been simmering in the back of my mind for months, emerged from the fog of my brain, sharp and terrifyingly clear. My go bag, the one I keep packed now, a constant companion in the passenger seat of my rig, wasn't a thing back then, but the mindset of a go bag, of meticulous preparation for flight or fight, was born then. I went to the special place by the cisterns, behind a false brick on the side of the farmhouse, where the sewage pipes were hidden from casual view. I had kept every black widow spider I'd come across. I'd started with 8, finding them cannibals when grouped. So I'd kept hosting my own macabre tournaments, pitting them against each other, watching the strongest, most venomous ones consume the weaker. By that morning, the original 108 black widows I'd collected had been reduced to 26 of the most toxic, twitchy, and bite-crazy widows you'd ever wish not to meet. I'd been bitten only twice during my gruesome breeding project, and both times I'd come terrifyingly close to an agonizing death, my small body convulsing, my vision blurring, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But I'd survived. I knew one bite wouldn't do a monster like Zinon in, but 26? That was a different story. I was set. I was ready to enact the last stage of my plan when everything changed on a cold day in early December. A helicopter, as black as the Thunderbird, made a couple of low, unsettling circles over the farm, its rotors chopping at the silent air like an angry god. The sight of that helicopter, an external force intruding on Zinon's isolated kingdom, snapped something in him. He went completely, violently insane. The very next day, he poisoned half of the meals, a frantic, desperate act of control. After breakfast, a horrifying silence fell. He took us all outside, herding us into a ragged queue outside the chicken slaughterhouse, a place of bloody, visceral death that usually only saw the headless carcasses of birds. When he began leading us in, one by one, a few of the older kids, eyes wide with terror, suddenly broke ranks. They ran. I joined them, a desperate, animalistic sprint towards the barbed wire, towards the woods. Judging from the screams that tore through the air moments later, he caught most of the runners, but he didn't catch me. I'd spent countless nights fantasizing about this moment, when I wasn't listening to his phantom footsteps or his sick, rasping breath. Every fiber of my being was primed for escape. I had the black widows secured inside an old, compartmentalized chocolate box I'd scavenged from a woodpile. perfect for keeping each venomous beauty locked away in its own tiny cell. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against my ribs. I scrambled up through the loose floorboards in the bathroom, pulling myself into the cramped, dust-choked space above the toilet. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and stale air, but it was a sanctuary. The headmaster, in his paranoia, might not sleep through the night, but everyone's gotta go eventually. Even monsters. Those cisterns didn't shit themselves. I pulled the planks back into place, listening for anything. It was dark by the time he arrived. The farmhouse had no electricity, only the flickering, sickly glow of a single candle he carried, its weak light casting grotesque, dancing shadows. I heard him pull down his trousers, the coarse fabric rasping against itself, followed by his guttural grunt of effort. That familiar, disgusting sound masked the faint creak of me moving the planks above him aside. My hand, trembling but steady, pulled the lid off the chocolate box. 26 nightmares, 26 pinpricks of pure, concentrated venom showered down upon the headmaster. My beauties began biting as soon as they landed. They were ravenous, crazed gladiators, primed for destruction. The terror of the child farm, the demon named Ranan Shinan, curled around his toilet, a grotesque parody of human vulnerability. His eyes, already swelling shut from the initial bites, were locked in a disgusted, surprised, and utterly outraged gurgle of horror. Spasms, violent and uncontrolled, racked his whole body, his limbs jerking like a puppet on cut strings. Before his eyes swelled completely shut, before the darkness claimed him, he saw my face, my small, 7-year-old face, peering down the hole in the darkness. The missing child, the one who had escaped. A strange, wet gurgle erupted from his throat, transforming into a horrifying cackle. It was a sound that would haunt my sleep for years, a deranged symphony of triumph and defeat. I knew this could happen, he rasped, his voice thick and wet, barely intelligible. There is no free will. It's fine. I lived 10,000 years already. I lived your happy summers, wonderful marriages, fruitful successes. Your life was beautiful beyond compare. That's why He smashed a few spiders scuttling around his face. A last, pathetic attempt at defiance, but I could tell he was fading fast. You and I are ghosts now, were his last intelligible words before the headmaster's breathing stopped, the last wet gurgle, the last shuddering spasm, and then silence, just the frantic tap-tapping of tiny arachnid feet receding into the cracks of the floorboards, leaving behind only the fading, putrid tang of a dying god. I hid for 4 hours, my body stiff with terror and adrenaline, before carefully making my way to the window, the safest place in the room. The spiders were done and gone. The chopper returned just before sunrise, its thudding rotors stirring the dawn air. It wasn't alone this time. A convoy of armed men, dressed in dark, tactical gear, streamed from the woods. I was the only survivor they found. The captain of the operation was a man named Clinton Moxley, chief field investigator for something called the Secured Bureau of Reclamation. He adopted me. He said I knew him from before. He even said he was able to find me due to tracers injected into me years ago. He named me Howard. I told my new father what little I knew, what fragments Xenon's torture had left me with. He corrected me on a few things, piecing together a narrative that felt too neat. He chooses victims who had good lives, my father would explain as he would tuck me in, his voice calm, reassuring, almost clinical. His existence is the greatest evidence that time is a physical dimension, something that exists and can be crafted and stolen. He lives your years in just a few seconds. We believe he is responsible for over 100,000 homeless children across the world. Another young human with a frail, old, used-up timeline. I asked the only father I knew why he adopted me, why he chose me. He brought me to the master bathroom's dual mirrors and told me to take off my shirt. "Because I owe you," he said, his eyes solemn, meeting mine in the reflection. "You were an old man once, Howard. You were my partner within the bureau. You were sent into the farm by yourself to try to shut it down. I will make sure you get the help you need to remember. I had hoped that you would remember something about your past on your own, but I see the headmaster got to you too." I looked behind me, using the set of mirrors to see my own back for the first time. It was covered in faded, but still visible, handprints. Some angry red, some dark purple, some the faint, indelible black of fingertips. The marks of Xenon, a permanent legacy on my skin. That was many years ago. True to Headmaster's twisted words, I have been a ghost among the living ever since. A shadow flitting through the world, disconnected, detached. Every job I take, every town I pass through, feels transient, temporary. The worn leather jacket I always wear, the one that feels like a second skin, is less a fashion statement and more a uniform of a life perpetually on the run. My old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick I developed somewhere along the lonely highways, is a desperate attempt to ground myself in a reality that feels increasingly fragile. It's been hard even sleeping, especially now. For the past few nights, the chill that settles around my bed isn't just the autumn air. I hear them. The headmaster's creaking footsteps, the sickening rasp of his breath, right there in the darkness. A phantom presence I can almost feel reaching for me. My father never said they found the headmaster's body. No one ever did. He wants his farm back. He wants me back. He wants all his children back. And sometimes, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, I can almost hear their silent, hungry pleas, rising from the earth, calling me home. The truth is, I've always been running from something far more fundamental than a single monster. I'm running from a past that isn't just mine, from a borrowed life, from the chilling, undeniable whisper that Sinan's farm, his twisted timeline, is still out there, calling me back to where my story truly began. And maybe deep down, a part of me, the part that's truly weary, wonders if I was ever meant to escape at all. Total character count, 9,788 characters. The metallic tang of something foul, like burnt copper mixed with bile, filled my mouth. My hands, slick with a hot, viscous fluid that wasn't mine, trembled around the stock of the antique blunderbuss. The roar of the shotgun was still ringing in my ears, a high-pitched whine that echoed the unholy shriek of the thing I'd just obliterated. What remained of it, a wet, pulsating ruin of merged limbs and grotesque, eyeless heads, splashed across the rough-hewn floor of the cabin, staining the mounted antlers and the dust-caked photographs with crimson and something darker, something alien. My breath hitched, a dry, ragged cough that clawed at my throat. It was done. It had to be done. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the suffocating weight of an empty tomb and the faint, phantom whispers of voices that would forever haunt my waking hours. It hadn't started this way. Of course, nothing ever does. It always begins with something mundane, a simple job, a wrong turn, or, in my case, a flicker of that cursed conscience I've spent a lifetime trying to suppress. This time, it was a delivery. Another out-of-the-way, off-the-grid drop-off for a seasonal lodge that looked more like a forgotten mausoleum buried deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. A 5-hour haul from the last patch of civilization, the kind of place where cell signals go to die and the trees watch you with ancient, unblinking eyes. My worn leather jacket felt heavier than usual on my shoulders, a familiar comfort, a second skin against the chill that seemed to seep from the very ground here. I checked my old analog wristwatch more times than I could count on the drive up. Not for the time, which held little meaning out here, but for the rhythmic tick, a small, mechanical anchor in a world that always seemed to be spinning just a little too fast. The sun was a pale smear in the sky when I finally wrestled the beat-up Tahoe through the last stretch of overgrown gravel. The kind of road that whispers, "Turn back," with every branch that scrapes against the paint. A thin plume of smoke curled from the cabin's chimney, a deceptively domestic sign. "Well, Buster," I muttered, glancing at the scruffy terrier curled up in the passenger seat, his eyes barely slits of contentment. "Looks like someone's home. Just drop the crates and go. Easy money." Buster offered a soft snore in response, an island of calm in the rising tide of my usual unease. He'd stay in the truck. This felt like a job best handled without a curious, four-legged companion underfoot. The cabin itself was a sprawling, rustic beast of dark timber and rough-hewn stone, framed by a thicket of ancient pines. Deer antlers adorned the front porch, the kind of taxidermy that always struck me as faintly morbid. As I killed the engine, the silence descended, thick and absolute. No chirping birds, no buzzing insects, not even the rustle of leaves. Just a profound, almost aggressive stillness that pricked the hairs on the back of my neck. I'd learned to trust that particular brand of quiet. It was the sound of something holding its breath. I hauled 2 large wooden crates from the back of the Tahoe. Winter provisions, the manifest had read. The kind of stuff people who really don't want to be found order. As I approached the front door, it swung inward before I could knock, revealing a man in his late 40s, his face etched with the kind of worry lines that had nothing to do with mortgage payments. He had a nervous energy about him, like a wire strung too tight. "You're the delivery?" he asked, his voice a little too loud, a little too quick. "Mr. Vance, right? Didn't expect you till later." "Leo," I corrected, shifting the weight of the crates. "Truck's faster than the paperwork. Glad to get it over with. Long drive." He nodded, pushing a hand through his thinning hair. "Right. Leo, I'm Mr. Davies. Just Davies is fine. Come on in." He stepped aside, revealing a large den dominated by a stone fireplace and more hunting trophies than I cared to count. 2 boys, younger than I expected, were lounging on a worn couch, glued to a static-filled portable radio. "These are my boys, Mark and Timmy," Davies said, gesturing vaguely. Mark, the older one, maybe 15, barely grunted, too engrossed in trying to coax a signal from the radio. Timmy, a kid no older than 8, looked up, his eyes bright with curiosity, a stark contrast to his father's frayed nerves. "We're trying to catch the meteor shower tonight. Supposed to be a good one?" "Meteor shower," I echoed, my lips twisting in a small, humorless smile. "Right. Well, I've got your order. Just need a signature." I dropped the crates near a large dining table, the wood scarred with generations of use. The cabin smelled of stale smoke and something vaguely metallic, like an old coin. Davies scribbled his name on my clipboard, his hand surprisingly unsteady. "Thanks, Leo. Appreciate you coming all this way." He sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "No problem," I said, already turning to leave. The truck and Buster were calling. The sense of foreboding was a cold knot in my gut, tightening with every second I stayed. But just as I reached the door, the cabin was plunged into an inky blackness. The radio on the couch died with a sputtering crackle. Davies swore, a sharp, choked sound. "What the?" Outside, a low, guttural rumble began, growing quickly into a deafening roar that vibrated through the very timbers of the cabin. It wasn't thunder. It was deeper, more resonant, like the earth itself was tearing open. The air outside turned frigid, then burned, thick with the smell of ozone and something acrid, metallic, like an overloaded transformer melting. "What's going on?" Mark yelled, his voice laced with genuine fear now, abandoning his futile attempts at a radio signal. Timmy whimpered, clinging to his father's leg. Through the large back window, which faced the East Valley, a blinding flash erupted, turning the oppressive night into a momentary, ghastly day. Then came the impact, A sound like 1,000 freight trains colliding. An explosion that rattled the fillings in my teeth and made the cabin groan on its foundations. Dust rained from the ceiling. "Stay here," Davies shouted, his voice cracking, as he fumbled for a flashlight he couldn't find in the sudden darkness. But my reluctant conscience, that self-sabotaging flaw, was already pulling me. It was the same old song and dance. See something wrong, know you should run, but some part of you, some broken, guilt-ridden shard, just has to know, just has to help. Always. "Power's out everywhere," I stated, pulling out my heavy-duty mag light from my go bag. Always within reach. The beam cut through the swirling dust, painting distorted shadows on the trophy-lined walls. Whatever that was, it wasn't a meteor shower, not a normal one. Anyway, "We have to go see," Davies said, already pushing past me, a frantic determination in his eyes. "No!" I barked, grabbing his arm. "Hold on! Something hit! Something big! And the power grid for miles is out. Think! You don't just run towards that." My words were laced with my usual cynicism, but underneath it, a genuine tremor of dread. This wasn't just a fire or a downed line. This felt wrong, deeply wrong. "Did you hear anything before this? Anything at all?" Davies shook his head, distracted, his gaze fixed on the back window where a faint, sickly green glow now pulsed from the valley's edge. "No, nothing. Just the radio. Then that crash." "Right," I muttered, letting go of his arm. He was too agitated to listen. Like a moth to a flame, people always gravitated toward the things that would destroy them. I hated it, but I also knew I wouldn't leave them. Not yet. Not with a small kid involved. That was the rub, my cursed Achilles heel. "Stay close," I ordered, my voice flat, holding the beam of the flashlight steady. "No running off, and don't touch anything." The trek was eerily silent. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell intensified, a chemical burn that singed my nostrils. A few miles down an old logging trail, the trees abruptly gave way to a fresh scar on the earth. The crater. It was a raw, gaping maw, steaming faintly with that acrid smell. The ground around it was blasted clean, and the soil was a strange, chalky white. Timmy, the younger boy, let out a whoop, momentarily forgetting his fear. "Wow, look, Dad!" Mark, the older one, hung back, his face pale in the maglight's beam. "It's deep. Too deep to be natural," I murmured, my gaze sweeping the perimeter. The rim of the crater was jagged, like teeth. I could feel a low vibration in the soles of my boots, a thrumming that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Something alien had landed here, something that shouldn't be. "We need to get a look," Davies said, already heading for the edge, ignoring my earlier warning. "Maybe it's a meteor, could be worth something." His voice was tinged with a desperate hope, a human attempt to rationalize the monstrous. "Don't," I warned, my voice tight. "Stay back, the ground's unstable." But as always, no one listened. Davies was already peering over the lip, his silhouette against the faint glow at the bottom of the pit. Mark was at his side, craning his neck. Timmy, of course, darted forward, curiosity overriding caution. Then, the ground gave way, not with a roar, but with a sickening, soft crumble. Timmy, right at the precipice, let out a choked cry as the earth beneath his feet simply dissolved. It happened in an awful slow motion, a nightmare unfolding in a silent film. My hand shot out, but he was already gone, tumbling into the inky blackness of the crater. His small, terrified scream echoed, then cut off abruptly. "Timmy!" Davies bellowed, his voice raw with terror. He lunged forward, but I caught him, hauling him back from the crumbling edge. "Stay put!" I snapped, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hold this!" I shoved the mag light into his trembling hand. "Mark, you got a rope? Something sturdy?" Mark, pale and shaking, pointed a trembling finger back towards the cabin. Basement. Dad's old climbing gear. Get it, I ordered, already sizing up a thick pine tree near the edge. Davies was sobbing, clutching the flashlight. Useless. My hands were already moving, a cold, focused efficiency taking over. This wasn't about heroism, it was about damage control. Another mess, another situation I was inexplicably dragged into. Mark returned minutes later, gasping, clutching a coil of thick rope. Here, it's Dad's. I didn't waste a second. I looped the rope around the sturdy pine trunk, testing its strength. Hold this in, tight, both of you. Don't let go, no matter what. Their terrified nods were all the assurance I got. I tied the rope securely around my waist, double-checking the knot with practiced hands. The air was thick with the scent of pine and alien ash. "Timmy!" I yelled into the black maw, then lowered myself in. The rope bit into my side, but I barely noticed. The maglite beam, held by Davies above, was a useless pinprick against the overwhelming darkness. I swung my legs, feeling for purchase against the slick, crumbling earth. The descent seemed to go on forever. The silence at the bottom punctuated only by the scrape of my boots and the ragged thump of my own heart. Finally, my feet hit something solid. The ground was cold, unyielding, and strangely smooth, riddled with indentations. I realized with a jolt of ice in my veins that I wasn't standing on rock, but on whatever had crashed here. The meteor wasn't rock. It was something else. My hand touched it, felt a slick, sticky residue, like thick, coagulated oil, seeping from a fracture in its surface. It smelled of that metallic burn, but also something else, something sweet and sickly, like spoiled fruit. "Timmy?" I whispered. My voice hushed, unwilling to disturb the oppressive quiet. My hands swept out in the darkness. Frantic, my fingers brushed against something small. Still, a foot. I fumbled, grabbing hold of an arm, pulling the boy's limp form closer. He was heavy but mercifully whole. Then I felt it, the warmth. A faint, shuddering pulse against my palm. He was alive, unconscious, but alive. A wave of nauseating relief washed over me, quickly replaced by a fresh surge of dread. There was blood and something else. A fine, black powder coated the right side of his face and hair, clumping in his eyelashes. It gleamed faintly in the sparse light that filtered down from above. My fingers, now coated in the sticky goo from the object, felt strangely numb. "He's alive!" I yelled up, my voice hoarse. "Pull me up, slow!" The ascent was excruciating, every tug on the rope sending shards of pain through my shoulders. Timmy, a dead weight in my arms, felt impossibly heavy. When I finally cleared the lip of the crater, Davies rushed forward, his face etched with a desperate hope that quickly turned to horror when he saw his youngest son. "Timmy! Oh God, Timmy!" He knelt, his hands hovering, afraid to touch. The black powder on Timmy's face was more visible now in the dim pre-dawn light. It wasn't just powder, it looked like something almost alive. Tiny, thread-like tendrils seemed to be slowly, almost imperceptibly, spreading into his skin, dissolving into it. His breathing was shallow, ragged, punctuated by gasps. "We need to get him to a hospital. Now," I said, my voice low, authoritative. I scooped the boy into my arms. "Mark, go start the Tahoe. Davies, help me clear the way." We stumbled back towards the cabin, the heavy weight of Timmy in my arms, my own body screaming with exhaustion in a growing, unsettling chill. My instincts were screaming at me. "Run! Just drop the kid and run." This wasn't my fight. This was something else. But then I looked at the boy's pale, innocent face, the black tendrils seeping into his skin, and the internal voice of my reluctant conscience. That suicidal bastard snarled, "Not yet." My worst fears solidified when we reached the Tahoe. I fumbled for the keys, jammed them into the ignition, and turned. Nothing. Just a dead click. The dashboard lights remained dark. The battery was completely drained. Whatever had crashed, it had acted like an EMP, sucking the life out of every electronic device for miles. "No, no, no," Davies sobbed, pounding the steering wheel. "It can't be. We're miles from anything. No signal. No car." "All right," I said, my voice flat, fighting down the rising panic. "Deep breaths. We take him inside. We stabilize him. Then we figure out what's next." My mind was racing, sifting through options, finding none. We were stranded, trapped. Inside the cabin, the air felt colder, heavier. I laid Timmy on the couch, the worn fabric stark against his unnatural pallor. The black material seemed to be spreading faster now, blooming across his skin like a perverse tattoo, turning his face a mottled, ashy gray. His eyes, though still closed, seemed to bulge slightly beneath the lids. "Get me a wet cloth, hot water," I barked at Davies, who stood frozen, helpless. "And any first aid kit you have," Davies snapped to, stumbling towards the kitchen. Mark, looking utterly terrified, hovered by his brother. What's happening to him?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice rough. I started tearing at Timmy's shirt, desperate to check for other injuries. Anything, but there was nothing but the insidious spread of the blackness. It pulsed, faintly, beneath his skin. Suddenly, Timmy convulsed, a violent, full-body spasm. His eyes snapped open, not blue or brown, but a murky, dark red, devoid of any recognition. A guttural cough tore from his throat, and a cloud of the black powder exploded from his mouth, hanging in the air like a noxious mist. He gagged, his small hands clawing at his own throat, his body arching off the couch. "Get him to the sink! Try to wash it off!" I roared, grabbing him, trying to pull him up, but his limbs were stiff, unresponsive. The material was now seeping into his airways, coating his tongue, his gums. It was a rapid, horrific transformation. Davies returned, a bowl of water sloshing, a towel draped over his arm, his face ashen. He dropped it all, staring at his son, his breath catching in his throat. Then Timmy went still, completely, utterly still. His chest ceased to rise and fall. His limbs, moments before stiff, now flopped back onto the couch, limp as a rag doll. The dark red eyes remained open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "No, no, Timmy," Davies whispered, collapsing to his knees beside the couch, clutching at his son's small hand. His shoulders shook with silent, agonizing sobs. Mark stood frozen, tears silently streaming down his face. I stood over them, my hand instinctively going to my wristwatch, turning the crown back and forth. Pointless. He was gone. The boy was gone, and whatever had taken him was still here. But then, a low, wet gurgle emanated from Timmy's throat. His body began to twitch, small, spasmodic jerks. The black powder that covered him began to flake off, slowly, almost gracefully, like ash from a dying fire. His skin, already gray, seemed to deepen in tone, becoming a uniform ashy brown. Then, with a sickening crack, his head lolled to the side, and his dark red eyes, now fully formed, swiveled towards us. The thing that now inhabited Timmy's small body let out a high-pitched, piercing shriek. It wasn't human. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated malice. It began to crawl from the couch, limbs jerking in an unnatural, spidery gait, the sound of tiny bones grinding beneath its flesh. Get back, now!" I roared, shoving Davies and Mark away from the grotesque abomination that was once their brother, their son. "Upstairs, get to the bedrooms!" Davies, propelled by sheer terror, scrambled back, pulling Mark with him, the creature shambling and twitching, seemed disoriented, bumping into the coffee table, a monstrous puppetry of a child's body. Was it blind, or was it adjusting? It's searching, I mumbled to myself, scanning the room for anything. Anything at all. The blunderbuss, the old hunting trophies, Davies's father's ancient firearm, still hanging on the wall. A desperate, long shot. The creature shrieked again, a louder, more directed sound this time, and coughed up another cloud of the black powder. It drifted towards me. I instinctively shielded my face, and where it touched my exposed skin, it burned, a sharp, searing pain. I yelped, stumbling back into the kitchen, hastily splashing water from the sink onto my arm, the feeling of acid eating at my flesh. This wasn't just a living thing, it was a weapon. It wanted to subdue, to kill, before I could even formulate a plan. The Timmy thing was in the kitchen, cornering me against the counter. Its face was still recognizable as the boy's, but stretched and distorted, the jaw hanging unnaturally low. A long, dark, segmented tongue, like something from an insect, slithered from his mouth, flicking out, tasting the air. My gut twisted with revulsion. He was gone. Their son was gone. And this thing was all that remained. "Get back!" I snarled, grabbing the largest hunting knife I could find from the butcher block, its polished blade reflecting the creature's distorted face. I plunged it into what I assumed was its chest, a sickening squelch. The creature roared, a sound of pain, but also of surprising power. It lashed out, its small, once human hands grabbing my arm, its grip impossibly strong. "Mark! Davies! Now!" I yelled, struggling against its grip. The blunderbuss. It was my only chance. As the creature brought its grotesque face closer, a fresh shriek tore from its lungs, and it reeled back. An arrow, fletched with what looked like turkey feathers, protruded from its side. I looked up. Mark, the older boy, stood at the top of the stairs, a crossbow clutched in his shaking hands. His face was a mask of furious grief. "Run, Mark, get out!" I bellowed, but he was already knocking another bolt, his eyes blazing with a desperate, suicidal courage. The creature, temporarily distracted, released me. It turned its malformed head towards Mark, its limbs scrabbling against the wall as it scaled it with unnerving speed, like a spider. My heart slammed against my ribs. No, not another one. "Mark!" I screamed, lunging for the crossbow I'd seen on the couch, the one he must have used, but it was too late. The creature, a horrifying parody of Timmy, was already upon Mark, grabbing him. It didn't just bite, it seemed to engulf him. More of the black, ashy smoke billowed from its form as it pressed itself against the terrified teenager. His screams quickly muffled. Mark fought, a thrashing, desperate struggle, but it was useless. The creature stretched, peeled itself over him, like a sickening, living sheet. I watched, horrified, as his body contorted, then fused into the growing mass. His cries stopped. Davies, who had stumbled down the stairs at the sound of the struggle, let out a wordless, agonizing shriek. "My boys, oh God, my boys!" He collapsed, unable to move, unable to fight. I grabbed the blunderbuss from its mount, my hands shaking. This was not how it was supposed to go. I should have left. I should have stayed in the truck. The rifle felt heavy, cold, a desperate and ancient solution to a wholly unnatural problem. The creature, now larger, more amorphous, with 2 sets of human limbs flailing and 3 distorted faces twisting in its bulk, let out a triumphant howl. It was moving faster, less confused, more deliberate. It was learning, evolving. "Davies, basement, now!" I roared, dragging the father, who was little more than a dead weight, towards the sliding glass doors at the back of the den, which led to the basement stairs. The creature shambled towards us, a nightmare of fused flesh and flailing appendages. We plunged into the relative darkness of the basement, slamming the door shut behind us. I fumbled for the light switch, remembering the power was out. My mag light. It was on the floor upstairs, where Davies had dropped it. I swore. "Barricade it! Anything! Now!" I gasped, pushing Davies forward. He was trembling, sobbing, barely functional. He stumbled over old boxes, discarded furniture. The banging began immediately, a rhythmic, heavy thudding against the flimsy wooden door. The sound of wood splintering. It wouldn't hold. "Is there another way out?" I demanded, my voice tight. "A window, a crawl space, anything." Davies, through his sobs, he pointed vaguely towards the far wall, near an old dryer. "Lint chute, goes outside. Old, small. Small is better than nothing," I yelled, already pushing aside a washing machine, revealing a narrow, dust-choked opening. It was barely wide enough for a grown man, but it was a chance. The creature's banging intensified, punctuated by wet, tearing sounds. The door wouldn't last another minute. "Go! Get out! Run! Don't look back! Don't stop!" I shoved Davies toward the opening. He hesitated, looking back at me, a flicker of desperate hope and profound fear in his eyes. He scrambled into the opening, his body scraping against the sides. Just as he vanished into the darkness of the crawl space, the basement door splintered inward with a deafening crack. The creature lurched through, no longer just a malformed boy, but a merging, churning mass of 2, then 3, bodies. Timmy's small face, Mark's lanky frame, and now, Davies's. No, he hadn't made it. He had doubled back, or hadn't been fast enough. My guts twisted. The 3 fused into a grotesque, multi-limbed horror, their faces constantly shifting, merging, separating, then fusing again into a single, gaping, dreadful maw, lined with rows of needle-sharp teeth. It let out a sound that was a sickening amalgamation of all their voices, a childish giggle, a teenage snarl, a man's dying scream, all twisted into a single, taunting shriek. It was impossibly large now, too large for the basement, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it tried to navigate the cramped space. It was slow. Its sheer bulk was its weakness. My eyes darted around the basement. What could kill this thing? The blunderbuss. It was still upstairs. Fire. Yes, fire. The old propane stove in the kitchen. The fireplace. I ran, scrambled up the remaining basement stairs, slamming the door shut behind me, the sound of the creature's frustrated roars echoing from below. I didn't bother with a barricade. It was pointless now. My mind was a whirlwind of desperate thoughts. Propane, ignition, fire. It was the only way. Burn it all down. Burn the cabin. Burn the monster. Burn the memory. I raced to the kitchen, my hands fumbling with the antique knobs of the propane stove, twisting them open, smelling the faint, gaseous hiss of the unlit burners. Ignition, matches, a lighter. I tore through drawers, my fingers brushing against forgotten kitchen utensils. Then I remembered Davy's father, an old tin tucked away in the den, full of dried tobacco and a Zippo lighter. I ran back to the den, the blunderbuss still clutched in my other hand. The creature was already hammering at the basement door, splintering the wood further. It wouldn't hold for long. I grabbed the tin, my fingers fumbling with the heavy Zippo. That's when I heard it, a guttural growl, then a wet, ripping sound from behind me. My blood ran cold. My head snapped around. From the hallway that led to the bedrooms, where Mark and Timmy had slept, where the memories of their humanity still lingered, something new was emerging, a fresh horror, not the lumbering, combined mass from the basement, but something leaner, faster. It was the hollow shell. The creature had found a way. It was tall, vaguely human-shaped, but its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, too serpentine. Its face was a featureless mask of gray ash. But the eyes were those same dark, malevolent red orbs I'd seen in Timmy's transformed body. And behind it, in the shadows of the hallway, I saw vague, cocoon-like shapes, swaying. The creature had copied them, recreated them. It was evolving beyond consumption. It was learning to mimic. The thing from the basement roared, tearing through the last of the door. The larger, merged monstrosity began to crawl up the stairs, filling the den with its bulk, a truly ungodly sight of twisted limbs and shifting faces. But the new one, the silent, ash-gray copy, was already in front of me, separating me from the kitchen, from the Zippo, from my only hope of fire. No, no more. My hand instinctively went to my wristwatch, pressing against the cold metal. A useless tick. My mind, usually cynical, detached, was now burning with a cold, clear rage. This wasn't about saving others anymore. It was about ending this. Ending it. Before it learned too much. Before it spread. The new creature lunged, surprisingly fast, but it was still learning. It wasn't the cunning, ancient horror I'd faced before, the ones that played with minds. This was raw, newly intelligent malevolence. I didn't hesitate. I raised the blunderbuss, the heavy, ancient metal cold against my cheek. I aimed not for its head, but for the gaping maw of the larger fused beast that was still struggling to pull itself fully from the basement, still roaring, still vulnerable. The one that housed the original core. "Get out of my head!" I screamed, pulling the trigger. The roar of the blunderbuss was deafening in the confined space. The impact was cataclysmic. A shower of blood, bone, and something black and glistening exploded across the den, coating the walls, the furniture, the silent, ash-gray copy, which recoiled, spasming violently as if struck by a phantom blow. The raw, guttural shriek of the merged creature was cut short, a wet gurgle, as its bulk finally collapsed, a ruin of shredded flesh and shattered bone. The silence that followed was absolute. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and something putrid, seemed to vibrate with the lingering echoes of horror. I stood there, chest heaving, the heavy blunderbuss still aimed at the smoking ruin. The ash-gray copy, the mimic, lay still, dissolving slowly into fine powder. Good. I stared at the ruin for a long time, my mind a blank, my body shaking with delayed adrenaline. Then, mechanically, I began to move. The propane, the fireplace, no witnesses, no traces. The cabin, a mausoleum of rock and wood, would be its pyre. It took hours, methodical, detached. I hauled the monstrosity's remains to the fireplace, shoveling the black, viscous goo and mangled bone into the roaring flames. The smell was unbearable, a stench that would forever haunt my nostrils. When I was done, when nothing but ash remained of the creature, and the cabin itself was starting to creak and groan, smoke curling from its rafters, I walked out into the pre-dawn cold. The sky was a bruised purple, promising a sunrise that felt like a mockery. Buster whimpered from the Tahoe, a soft, worried sound. I got in, started the truck, the engine miraculously sputtering to life, and leaned back against the headrest, my hands still shaking. My old watch was still ticking, a small, defiant constant. The cabin was burning brightly behind me, a funeral pyre against the coming dawn. Good, let it burn. Let it erase this. But I knew it wouldn't. Nothing ever truly burned away. It merely changed form. The creature had evolved. It had learned to consume, then to merge, then to replicate, to hide, that last silent mimic with its intelligent, malevolent eyes. It was a chilling thought. It was learning to pass, to blend. I wondered how many other meteor showers had occurred across forgotten corners of the world. How many empty cabins? How many missing families? My hand went to my arm, where the black powder had burned me. The skin was raw, red, but not infected. Not yet. But the paranoia was already setting in, settling deep into my bones, a cold, insidious dread. What if a single cell remained? What if a fleck of that ash had already found its way into my bloodstream, into my mind? I was Leo Vance, the haunted everyman, the weary wanderer, and now I carried another layer of the universe's indifference, another scar on my soul, another proof that there was no escaping the things that lurked in the dark, and that the only true horror was the one that learned to wear a human face. My only comfort was Buster's soft breathing beside me. He was oblivious, a warm, innocent weight. I would keep him safe. I would keep moving. And I would always, always be watching. They were out there. And now, I knew. They were learning to hide. Total characters, 9,876. The acrid taste of ash choked my throat, a phantom residue of smoke that coated my tongue and the back of my eyes. Fire. Always fire. Not the kind that warms, but the hungry, consuming kind that had once eaten my childhood and now gnawed at the edges of my sanity. My scalp throbbed, raw and alien, a chilling testament to a violation I couldn't fully recall, only feel. The world was a blurry, lurching canvas of green and gray, the rhythmic thud of tires on asphalt, a cruel lullaby against the phantom echoes of screams. My body was a bruised, battered sack of bones, the worn leather of my jacket cold and stiff against my skin, a mocking reminder of the inferno I'd somehow crawled out of. The voices, those goddamn voices, were mercifully silent, leaving behind an echoing void far more terrifying than their screams. They had been there, a cacophony of terror and desperate pleas, before the flames licked the sky and the ground swallowed me whole. And the man, always the man, his eyes reflecting the impossible light of an unseen fire, his smile a chilling benediction of madness and triumph. He was still out there. I knew it in the marrow of my bones. That nightmare, vivid and unshakable, was the culmination of 3 days lost to a darkness that had begun, as always, with a quiet night shift and a profound sense of wrongness at a godforsaken gas station in the middle of nowhere. It had been Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday. The days blurred into one long, greasy smear of transient jobs and cheap coffee. The clock on the wall, a garish red digital monstrosity, had just blinked 3:17 a.m. My old analog wristwatch, the one I checked more out of nervous habit than any actual need to know the time, confirmed it. The station was the kind of place that thrived on desperation and proximity to an interstate highway that went nowhere interesting. A 24-hour beacon of flickering fluorescent light, casting the usual strange, sickly yellow shadows on the tiled floor. Just another stop on the endless circuit of anonymity I'd carved out for myself. Another quiet shift, I'd told myself. Just another lonely stretch of road, another brief, forgettable interaction with the insomniacs and the truckers and the occasional lost soul. Funny how the quiet ones always exploded, didn't they? Reminded me of that frozen mountain pass, the one where the silence had been so heavy. It had screamed before the spectral headlights had materialized. The lot outside was empty, just the usual tumbleweeds of discarded fast food wrappers skittering in the dust, pushed by a wind that always seemed to carry the scent of something vaguely industrial and profoundly lonely. But despite the stillness, a prickle of unease had already started to crawl up my neck, that familiar sense of being watched, not by a person, but by the hungry, unseen edges of the world. My worn leather jacket felt heavier than usual on my shoulders, a familiar comfort against an unnamed chill. Then the bell above the door jingled, and the night shifted. The man who walked in was wrong, not obviously so, not in a way you could point to, but wrong. He was humming, a low, tuneless drone that grated on my ears, a nonsensical series of notes that felt like a chisel working on the inside of my skull. He wore a tailored suit, an immaculate charcoal gray that looked freshly pressed, an absurd choice for a grimy gas station at this ungodly hour. His polished leather shoes clicked ominously on the stained tiles, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. He moved with a disturbing grace, almost floating, as if his feet barely touched the ground. "What's your name, sweetie?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that, despite its cultured tone, felt like a threat. It was an unsettling mix of charm and menace, like a predator wearing a silk scarf. His eyes, though, they were the worst, dark and piercing. They glinted with a cold, predatory gleam that made my stomach churn, a knot tightening in my gut. He was a salesman of nightmares, and I was on the inventory list. The faint scent of expensive cologne, overlaid with something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old blood mixed with iron, lingered in the air, adding to the suffocating tension. I checked my watch, a useless gesture. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I can see them in there. Don't try to hide." His words hung in the stale air, burrowing into my thoughts like splinters under the nail. I forced a laugh, a dry, raspy sound that even to my own ears sounded like a death rattle. "See what, buddy? My impending debt? The existential dread of working a graveyard shift?" My cynicism was a reflex, a shield I always deployed, but it felt flimsy against his gaze. He didn't blink. His dark eyes remained fixed on me, intense and unyielding, as if he could peel back the layers of my skull and rummage through my gray matter. It was the kind of look that made you wonder if the monster wasn't under the bed, but already wearing your face. I thought of Mitch, or what I thought was Mitch, and the things that had been living inside the walls. The enemy wasn't just outside anymore. It could be whispering from within, or looking out through familiar eyes. He didn't answer my sarcasm. He just held my gaze, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. My skin crawled. A few nights later, the madness truly began. I was still wrestling with the memory of the suit, trying to convince myself it was just some rich eccentric, when the bell jingled again. This time it was a different kind of wrong. A disheveled, frantic old man stumbled through the door, his clothes hanging off him like a scarecrow's rags, his wild, bloodshot eyes darting to every shadowed corner of the gas station, as if expecting the fluorescent lights to suddenly drop him into a different dimension. He muttered incoherent syllables, twisting into phrases about a man in a van and three voices that sing. His words were strung together by an undercurrent of fear so palpable, so raw, that it made the hairs on my arms stand on end. He was terrified, genuinely, irrevocably terrified, and my reluctant conscience, that annoying little spark of decency I wished I could snuff out, gave a painful twitch. I should have turned away. I should have told him to leave. But I didn't. "Easy there, Wasso, old-timer," I said, trying to inject some calm into the charged air. "What's got you so rattled?" He didn't hear me. He was staring past me, at something in the darkened corner behind the counter, something only he could see. "He's coming for them," he rasped, his voice a dry, papery whisper. Then, before I could react, his cold, trembling fingers jabbed out and touched my forehead. Not a poke, not a tap, but a deliberate, chilling touch that lingered there, pressing into my skin. An icy current ripped through me, a sensation like 1,000 tiny needles prickling my scalp, then burrowing deeper, into my very thoughts. His breath, when he whispered, carried that same metallic tang I'd smelled from the man in the suit. "You're hiding them, aren't you? I can hear them in you." His words struck me like a match against flint, igniting something dormant inside me. It wasn't just the cold. It was a faint pulse, a distant echo in the back of my mind, growing louder, more insistent. It felt like something had just clicked into place, or rather, had been forced into place. That was the first night I heard them. Not thoughts, not inner monologues, but actual whispers. They were faint and fragmented at first, like distant cries carried on the wind. But they were there. "Don't take the pills," and they murmured, faint and fragmented, like distant cries carried on the wind. Their words sent a chill down my spine, leaving a knot of unease in my stomach. What pills? I didn't take pills. Not anymore. Not since the last quack had tried to medicate the ghosts out of my head. My hand went to my watch, fiddling with the crown, trying to ground myself. As the days passed, the whispers became louder, more insistent, their desperation clawing at the edges of my sanity. "Eve, you need to listen," they pleaded, their tone heavy with urgency and dread. Eve? I wasn't Eve. My name was Leo. But the voices didn't care. Their presence seeped into every corner of my mind, filling it with an oppressive weight that made every breath feel labored. Each day, the voices grew more intrusive, their demands relentless, punctuated by jarring flashes of memories that didn't belong to me. Images of fire raging uncontrollably, anguished screams tearing through the air, and the dark, menacing silhouette of a van parked under a dim, flickering streetlight. The smell of burnt wood and something else, something wrong, dragged me back to a place I fought to keep locked away. A house consumed by flames, echoing with screams that were far too familiar. Sycamore Grove. Always Sycamore Grove. The weight of these visions made my chest tighten, as if an unseen force was squeezing the air from my lungs. The whispers became a chorus. "He's coming. He sees us. He sees you." Then, one fateful night, my customers showed up. Or rather, what passed for customers in this dead zone. 3 teenagers, loud and boisterous, tumbling out of a beat-up sedan, Ace, Beck, and Freddie. They were regulars from the local high school. I gathered from their chatter, but strangers to me, which was exactly how I liked it. Ace, the loudest, was already trying to swipe a bag of chips. Beck, all nervous energy, tried to stop him. Freddie, quiet and sullen, watched them both. Just kids, I thought, rolling my eyes, already calculating how long until they left so I could return to my quiet misery. My glance drifted to the frozen food aisle, and my blood ran cold. The man in the suit was back. He was lurking near the freezers, a silent, dark stain against the bright white of the ice cream section. He wasn't looking at the kids. He was looking at me, and his smile, slow and predatory, widened. The voices in my head, the ones that called me Eve, screamed. "Run!" they begged, a cacophony of panicked whispers. "He sees us! He knows!" But I was frozen, rooted to the spot, my hand instinctively going to my wristwatch, my thumb tracing the cold metal. My heart raced, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, as his dark eyes bored into mine. He took a single, deliberate step closer, then another, then moved as if to pass me, heading towards the front door. "They're louder now, aren't they?" he murmured as he passed, his voice a low, chilling hiss that felt like it slid directly into my brain, bypassing my ears entirely. It wasn't a question, it was an acknowledgement. He knew. He was doing this, and I was just a conduit, just another way for him to hunt. The thought made me want to puke. His immaculate suit, the chilling polish of his shoes. It was the kind of deceptive normalcy that made my gut clench. Reminded me of that other collector, the one who saw people as ingredients, or the woman who curated human skin and antique furniture. Monsters always dressed well, didn't they? And this one seemed to know me, in a way that twisted my insides. He wasn't just observing, he was hunting. It happened when I stepped into the back parking lot, taking out the overflowing dumpster of forgotten hopes and stale bread. The shadows shifted, not just the natural play of dim light and deeper gloom, but a living, malevolent ripple in the fabric of the night. They coalesced, forming into a towering, impossibly elongated figure. It was jagged and angular, as if the darkness itself had conspired to give it a grotesque, almost skeletal shape. A low, guttural growl emanated from its chest, a sound that vibrated in the air like a distant thunderstorm, rattling the fillings in my teeth. It was carrying something, slung casually over its shoulder. Ace, unconscious, his limbs dangling limply. The creature's movements were deliberate yet grotesquely fluid, each step accompanied by the faint crunch of gravel beneath its non-existent feet. Its head tilted unnaturally, a mere suggestion of a skull, as though it were studying its surroundings with a predatory focus. Then, blindingly, a pair of headlights ignited, cutting through the oppressive gloom. It was a black van, idling at the edge of the lot, its windows tinted to an inky blackness. And there, bathed in the sudden glare, was the man in the suit, opening the back doors of the van, a faint, unsettling smile playing on his lips. As he loaded Ace's limp body into the back, I saw them, faint, pulsing symbols etched into the van's side, glowing with a sickly, ethereal light. They seemed to writhe and pulse like living things, like veins filled with corrupted blood. My breath caught in my throat, a scream trapped in my lungs. "Bad man!" A voice croaked behind me, a wet, gurgling sound that made me spin around. It was Elliot, the missing sheriff's son. I remembered the bulletins, the flyers tacked to every gas station door. He was a pale, spectral figure, his eyes wide and vacant, his bandaged head dripping with a viscous, pinkish froth that looked like strawberry milk mixed with something far more sinister. He was a ghost, or something worse. He reeked of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying, like a funeral bouquet left to rot. Before I could even think, before the terror could fully crystallize into a plan of escape, Elliot lunged. He was impossibly strong, his hands like cold iron, shoving me forward, sending me tumbling headfirst into the back of the van with a jarring thud that knocked the wind out of me. The doors slammed shut, plunging me into instant, suffocating darkness. Inside the van, the air was a thick, cloying soup of gasoline, stale blood, and decay. The stench coated my tongue, burned my nostrils, and made my eyes water. It was a steel casket on wheels, and I was trapped. My hands scrabbled in the darkness, touching the cold, metallic walls. They were not smooth. They were lined with carvings, strange markings that glowed faintly, a sinister bioluminescence in the oppressive blackness. These were the symbols I'd seen on the outside, now surrounding me. The van wasn't just a vehicle. It was a mobile cell, a ritual space on wheels. The voices were deafening now, no longer whispers but frantic, jumbled screams inside my head, yet somehow outside too, as if they were coming from every molecule of air in the van. "You should have listened," they shrieked, their tone tinged with frantic regret. "He took us. He'll take you." I could hear other sounds in the darkness. A choked sob. It was Beck, huddled in a corner, her small body shaking with terror. Freddie's voice hushed and desperate, trying to comfort her. Ace lay motionless, his face pale and waxy, utterly still. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate bird trying to escape a cage. The feeling of being trapped, helpless, clawed at me, bringing back the visceral horror of being swallowed by the walls, unable to breathe, in a place I thought was safe, the sheer, suffocating finality of it. The van lurched forward, gaining speed, rumbling down what felt like a dirt road. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then it stopped. The doors hissed open, and the cold night air, thick with the scent of gasoline and decay, assaulted my senses. The man in the suit was there, his silhouette framed against the moonlight, a dark, elegant harbinger of doom. He dragged us out one by one. First Ace, still limp, then Beck and Freddie, their struggles weak and pathetic against his inhuman strength. Finally, it was my turn. He gripped my arm, his fingers like steel clamps, and hauled me out. I stumbled, my legs stiff, nearly collapsing onto the rough ground. We were led to a clearing, a bowl-shaped depression in the earth. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and something fouler, something meaty and metallic, like an open wound festering in the dark. It clawed at my throat, making me gag. A large bonfire crackled malevolently in the center, its flames casting dancing, distorted shadows against the surrounding trees. Around it, a circle of figures stood, their faces obscured by deep, hooded cloaks. Faint murmurs and whispers floated on the breeze, an otherworldly cadence that made my skin crawl, a language that twisted my very soul. The crunch of dried leaves underfoot seemed deafening in the oppressive silence, punctuated by the distant crackle of the flames. The hooded figures began to sway in unison, their movements eerily synchronized, like a single monstrous entity. Each step I took seemed to amplify the malevolence of the atmosphere, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Looking at them, swaying in that infernal circle, I felt that familiar, stomach-lurching dread. We weren't just victims, we were livestock, caught in some cosmic abattoir. Just like that damn farm I'd seen in the deepest, darkest corner of my own brief oblivion. This wasn't some random act of cruelty. This was harvesting. The man in the suit stepped into the center of the circle, raising his hands. He began to chant, his voice low at first, then growing in volume, a language that made my skin crawl, syllables twisting and vibrating in the air like a low hum, a physical assault on my eardrums. It was a language of pure malevolence, something ancient and hungry. Beck screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror, as the flames of the bonfire seemed to surge, reaching out like hungry tongues. Freddie, bless her brave, foolish heart, tried to shield her, to pull her away, but it was no use. The hooded figures began to hum, a deep, resonating drone that vibrated through the ground, through my bones. The voices in my head, the echoes of the trapped, the ones who called me Eve, were deafening now, a cacophony of fear and white-hot anger. "Stop him," they commanded, their collective will pressing down on me, urging me forward. "You have to stop him!" My body moved on its own, driven by their desperation, by that accursed, ingrained reluctance to let suffering go unanswered, even if it meant my own. It was a stupid, suicidal impulse, but I couldn't stop it. I lunged at the man in the suit, my hands clawing at his face, aiming for those cold, predatory eyes. I was a fly hitting a brick wall. His laughter, cold and triumphant, echoed in the clearing as he effortlessly tossed me aside like a rag doll. My head hit something hard, a rock, a tree root, and the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of pain and blackness. 3 days later, I woke up on the side of a lonely, anonymous road, miles from anywhere. My body was a roadmap of bruises and aching joints. My head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache, and when I instinctively reached up to feel the pain, my fingers met not the familiar stubble of my hair, but bare skin. My scalp was raw, scraped clean, shaved bald. It was a bizarre, chilling violation, a symbol of everything that had been stripped from me, for reasons I couldn't comprehend. The voices were silent. For now, the silence was more terrifying than any scream. "What happened?" my mother sobbed, her face blurry, distorted by tears, as paramedics loaded me onto a stretcher and into an ambulance. She was a figment of my trauma, an echo of a life I'd lost, a symptom of the concussion, no doubt. But how could I explain what I didn't fully understand myself? How could I tell her about the voices, the man in the suit, the shadow figure, the ritual, the horrifying van? They wouldn't believe me. They never did, and they didn't. "Evelyn," the doctors insisted, their voices flat and devoid of empathy, their eyes clinically assessing me for madness. "There's no way they're in your head. You've experienced severe trauma." They prescribed stronger meds, the kind that promised to numb not just the pain, but the inconvenient truth. I took them for a while, because what else could I do? I let them diagnose me, medicate me, pathologize the truth into a delusion. It was easier than trying to fight, but every time I closed my eyes, the images flickered behind my eyelids, the raging flames, the swaying hooded figures, and the man in the suit's cold, triumphant smile. In the weeks that followed, the whispers returned, faint but persistent. They were different now, their tone laced with a grim urgency. Not just pleas for help, but warnings. "It's not over," they warned, a chorus of ghostly voices. "He's still out there, and he's watching." I began to see flashes of him in my mind's eye, standing in a crowd, watching from a distance, always just out of reach. A chilling confirmation that the nightmare was far from over. I can still hear them, faint but persistent, Beck's prayers, whispered like a dying breath, Ace's rage, a furious, impotent echo, Freddie's sorrowful murmurs, forever clinging to hope. They're inside me, lodged in some twisted corner of my awareness, and they're growing stronger. "Don't let him win," they chant in unison now, a desperate, mournful choir. I don't know who they're warning me about specifically, but I fear the man in the suit isn't finished with us yet. He saw something in me, something he wanted or something he wanted to use, somewhere in the distance. I can hear the faint hum of an engine, a low thrum that vibrates through the earth, and the haunting echo of his laughter. The sound sends a cold shiver down my spine, a grim reminder that the nightmare isn't over. My mind churns with dread, wondering if I'll ever be free from the horrors he's embedded within me. The voices stir, their whispers growing louder as fear grips me. "You can't run forever," they murmur, their words blurring with my own thoughts. The line between what's real and what's within me continues to dissolve, leaving me trapped in an endless cycle of terror, a puppet on a string, dancing to the tune of the dead. The black van's headlights pierce through my nightmares, a chilling reminder that the shadows in the night are far from gone. Character count 9942. The hum wasn't just in the air, it vibrated in my teeth, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to emanate from Peggy's cubicle. Wrapping around the fluorescent lights and curdling the stale office air, she was there, hunched over her desk, a skeletal caricature of the woman who'd once consumed entire pizza boxes in a single sitting. Her skin, stretched taut over newly prominent bone, gleamed with an unnatural, almost phosphorescent pallor, thin as tracing paper. Her eyes, sunken deep in shadowed sockets, seemed to hold the cold, empty vastness of a forgotten galaxy. In her hands, a shriveled, dark lump of fabric, no bigger than a child's fist, writhed faintly. The rubber bands that had once cinched its middle were now mere suggestions, absorbed into the desiccated form. The metallic tang, once faint, now clawed at the back of my throat like fresh blood. This wasn't weight loss, this was consumption. And I knew, with a certainty that iced my veins, that the doll hadn't just taken her fat, it had taken her life. How did it come to this? How did the banal, soul-crushing monotony of cubicle life twist into something so profoundly, viscerally wrong? It started, as these things often do, with something utterly pedestrian, something as mundane as a misplaced sense of ambition and a $5 bet. It started with a diet contest. The fluorescence in the office hummed with the steady, oppressive drone of 1,000 dying flies. Each flicker felt like a tiny electric shock directly to my optic nerve. Another Tuesday, another endless day pretending to debug systems that were probably designed by a drunk chimpanzee. My current gig was a temporary contract with a tech consulting firm, shunted off to some generic corporate beehive in the sprawling industrial park on the edge of town. Temporary IT support, they'd called it. I called it another stopgap, another way to keep moving without leaving too many footprints. My worn leather jacket was slung over the back of my ergonomic nightmare chair. a constant, comforting presence, even indoors. My fingers, calloused from too many different kinds of physical labor, automatically went to the crown of my analog wristwatch. Almost 9 a.m., time for the daily parade of miserable, self-important faces to begin. I didn't care for office politics, or office anything, really. I was a phantom, moving through their lives, fixing their broken spreadsheets and jammed printers, then vanishing. But even phantoms, I was learning, couldn't escape the pervasive stupidity of the living. It all started, as all truly idiotic endeavors seem to, with the holidays looming, the corporate-mandated cheer, the forced camaraderie, the inevitable glut of saccharine treats and bland casseroles. I'd overheard the discussions in the break room, a low thrum of desperation under the forced smiles. "Gotta get ahead of the holiday wait," someone had chirped, as if a few weeks of self-deprivation could outrun a lifetime of bad choices and pumpkin pie. My internal monologue, a cynical Greek chorus, had already composed a dozen sarcastic remarks about the futility of it all, people chasing a feeling of control, a brief illusion of triumph over their own biology, before surrendering to the annual binge and purge cycle. It was pathetic and vaguely familiar, like watching someone desperately try to sweep back a rising tide with a broom. I knew that feeling. The tide always won. Then came the diet contest, a pool of $50 each, winner take all, based on percentage of body weight lost. Pathetic, but lucrative enough if I wanted to skip town a little earlier. Not that I had any real interest. Eating less felt like a form of self-torture I wasn't keen on adding to my repertoire. But there was money involved, and a perverse curiosity had taken root. I was in a cubicle. After all, what else was there to do but observe? My name was Leo, and I was, for the moment, a ghost in their machine. The players, Morgan from collections, a woman whose smile seemed to be perpetually glued on with superglue, Kim from shipping and receiving, quiet, efficient, and perpetually stressed, Jim and Tanner, my cubicle neighbors from IT, both looking like they were still recovering from last night's LAN party. And then there was Peggy. Peggy. Even the name felt soft, squishy, like a marshmallow. She sat in the cubicle directly across from mine, separated only by a flimsy partition that did nothing to dampen the symphony of her existence. Her existence, as far as I could tell, revolved entirely around the act of consumption. "That girl is always shoving something down her gullet," the original narrator, Andrea, had noted. Andrea, who was now me. And yes, she was right. It was less an observation and more a primal, inescapable fact of the office ecosystem. The constant crinkle of cellophane, the soft tearing sound of a chip bag opening, the wet, rhythmic chew of something unidentifiable. It was the background score to my day, an irritating, inescapable rhythm. Peggy was big, not just a little extra big, but substantial. Her giggles, frequent and high-pitched, seemed to shake the very foundations of her cubicle. She reminded me of a human embodiment of the snack aisle, perpetually radiating a faint aura of processed sugar and fried potato. My initial assessment, shared by what seemed to be the entire office, was that Peggy was the contest-designated loser, a guaranteed $50. Poor Jim, the beer enthusiast, was a close second for predicted failure. The first weigh-in day, Peggy clocked in at a staggering 336 pounds. The number itself seemed to hum with potential energy, a monument to caloric intake. I remember thinking, with a cynical smirk, that she'd be lucky to shed a single pound without literally amputating a limb. But then, at the end of the day, I heard her on the phone, a conspiratorial whisper, a faint echo of triumph. "I've already lost 3 LAs. My eyebrows probably did a slow creep towards my hairline. 3 pounds? I'd spent the entire day within earshot, and all I'd heard was the constant rustle of wrappers and the telltale grating sound of half a pound of cheese being sacrificed to a plate of home fries from that greasy spoon down the street. It defied all known laws of thermodynamics and basic human biology. My cynical mind immediately supplied the most mundane, if unappetizing, explanation, a pre-weigh-in cleanse of the most fundamental kind. A truly heroic dump. Gotta hand it to her. That would be dedication. The next few days settled into a predictable, dreary rhythm. The air in the office began to thicken, a subtle aroma of steamed kale, raw broccoli, and the faint, institutional tang of low-sodium soup. The microwave, usually a bastion of leftover pizza and sad sandwiches, now buzzed with the righteous indignation of healthy choice frozen meals. The soda machine, normally a busy accomplice in the office's collective sugar addiction, stood silent, a gentle weeping from its unused dispenser. Everyone was hungry. The collective hunger was a palpable thing, a low growl in the office, occasionally punctuated by a desperate sigh or the frantic crunch of a carrot stick. Me? I was hungry, not just for food, but for something to make sense. My internal monologue was a revolving door of sarcastic complaints about my growling stomach and the sheer absurdity of it all. I'd dropped a couple of pounds myself. Water weight, probably, a temporary mirage of progress. Morgan was down 2, Kim 1, Tanner a respectable 3. Poor Jim, trapped between his love for beer and the looming threat of the scale, had somehow gained 2 pounds. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Sympathy was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. And then there was Peggy. Oh, Peggy. While the rest of us were gnawing on raw vegetables and dreaming of pizza, Peggy was orchestrating a culinary tour de force from her cubicle. 2 Grubhub deliveries in one day, Chinese food, the sweet and sour tang of it drifting into my own sterile space, followed a few hours later by a half-dozen gourmet cupcakes. And an hour after that, the unmistakable rip of a sleeve of Ritz crackers. I knew that sound. It was the sound of childhood, of comfort, of everything that was verboten in the current dietary crusade. It was the sound of defiance, or madness, or both. Wednesday morning, the buzz started. Peggy and Kim, her designated witness, returned from the scales. A hush fell over the IT section, a morbid curiosity. And then, the announcement, Peggy had dropped another 6 pounds. 6 pounds. My internal cynicism, usually a granite wall, developed a hairline fracture. This wasn't a dump. This wasn't even a tapeworm. Where does one even get a tapeworm these days? I found myself thinking, absurdly, asking for a friend, obviously. The days blurred into a grotesque, food-centric nightmare. My observations of Peggy became almost obsessive. It was like watching a particularly disturbing nature documentary, except the prey was her own body, and the predator was a mystery. Thursday, she managed to consume an entire meat lover's pizza, followed by a full pancake and sausage breakfast with biscuits and gravy. My stomach, already a hollow pit of hunger, writhed in protest, a phantom agony that mixed with the real one. Where was she putting it all? It defied not just basic biology, but the laws of physics. It was like watching a black hole in a cardigan. And then, the sound. The slow, deliberate peel of a full-size bag of double-stuffed Oreos. The horror, that particular sound, like a whispered promise of forbidden bliss, was seared into my brain. I knew Oreos. I knew their sweet, comforting, deeply sinful embrace. And Peggy was eating them, all of them, unapologetically. By Friday, the office was a hive of whispers. Peggy, another 6 pounds down, 15 pounds in less than 5 days. It wasn't just the numbers anymore. Her clothes, which had once strained against her frame like an overinflated balloon, now hung loosely, almost comically. She was quite literally shrinking before our eyes. This wasn't normal. My world-weary mind, usually quick to dismiss the strange as merely idiosyncratic human behavior, now felt a prickle of genuine unease. This was the kind of wrongness I'd grown to recognize, the kind that whispered of something unnatural slithering beneath the surface of the mundane. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this pull, this cold dread that seeped into my bones, a ghost of past horrors. It was the same feeling I got when the shadows stretched too long, or the silence became too profound, or when a fleeting memory of a certain house, consumed by fire, threatened to break through the carefully constructed walls of my amnesia. I ran from these things. Yes, always. But sometimes, they simply appeared around me, like a particularly noxious atmospheric condition. And then I was trapped, a reluctant observer. It was the incense that cemented my unease. Peggy started burning it in her cubicle. Patchouli, probably. That sweet, cloying smell, vaguely reminiscent of a college fling who owned too many tie-dye shirts and bathed too infrequently. I didn't mind the smell itself, but it was there, an alien element in the sterile corporate air. And then, the whispers, low, rhythmic, almost chanting. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as stress-induced mumbling, but the sounds were too deliberate, too focused. It was the sound of devotion, or desperation, or magic. My cynical mind scoffed. Magic. Right. Next, I'd be seeing unicorns in the server room. Over the weekend, the image of Peggy, shrinking and whispering, eating like a starved beast while shedding weight like water, gnawed at me. My usual coping mechanism was to hit the road, find a new job, blend into a new landscape. But I was stuck here, at least for another few weeks, and that meant the wrongness was still in my periphery. I found myself online, searching, not for diet tips, but for something far stranger. Weight magic. Rituals for shedding pounds. I scrolled through forums, eyes scanning the conspiracy theories and desperate pleas. Stories of focus objects, dolls, tokens, photos. It sounded like the ramblings of the desperate, the truly unhinged, but a seed of dread had been planted. Monday morning, the office was back to its usual blend of apathy and ambition. But Peggy was different. Not just lighter, but changed. Her clothing, once merely loose, now seemed to swamp her. She radiated a smug, almost malevolent satisfaction. "Down another 10 pounds, she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the cubicles, a chillingly triumphant declaration. Morgan offered a forced, saccharine congratulations, a mask of enthusiasm barely hiding her envy. Hard work and determination. Peggy giggled, a sound that no longer felt lighthearted, but brittle, sharp, like breaking glass. And then her hand, almost casually, brushed against something on her desk. My eyes, trained by years of unwelcome experience to notice the subtle distortions in reality, locked onto it. A small, crudely made rag doll. It was lumpy, uneven, and disturbingly misshapen. But what truly caught my attention was the string tied tightly around its middle. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, tracked its way down my spine. This wasn't some cute desk ornament. This was the focus object, the thing that held the secret. My gut twisted, a familiar knot of dread. This was it. The mundane had finally bled into the monstrous. When Peggy waddled out for lunch, presumably to continue her grand, paradoxical feast, I seized my chance. It was stupid, reckless. Everything in my being screamed to stay away, to let the madness consume her. Not me, but that cursed spark, that reluctant conscience, flared. Something about the sheer wrongness of it, the visible erosion of a human life for something as petty as a weight loss contest, wouldn't let me go. I couldn't just stand by. Not completely, not yet. I moved with the cautious silence of a predator or prey. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of a keyboard. My footsteps were soft on the industrial carpet as I approached Peggy's cubicle. The air here was thicker, heavy with the cloying sweetness of stale incense and something else, a faint, metallic smell, like old pennies or iron, blood. My stomach lurched. Up close, the doll was worse, far worse than I'd imagined. It wasn't just string. It was wrapped in what looked like thick, dark rubber bands, cinching its middle to an unnatural, impossible thinness. The fabric, a dull, dark gray, felt damp to the touch, and the metallic tang was stronger here, almost overwhelming. It was cold, too, despite the ambient warmth of the office, as if something vital had been leached from it. I could almost hear the faint, desperate gasp of the doll as the bands tightened, drawing it further into itself. This wasn't just a symbol, it was a recipient, a reservoir. A wave of nausea washed over me. I jerked my hand back, scrubbing it against my jeans as if to wipe away the sensation of its unnatural coldness. My skin felt clammy, a familiar reaction to the burgeoning horror. The dread coiled in my gut, hot and suffocating. This was no mere diet contest. This was a dark, twisted ritual, playing out in fluorescent-lit banality. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, desperate to put distance between myself and the shriveled thing on Peggy's desk. I had to get out, to flee. But I didn't. I couldn't. Not when the answers were just within reach. The urge to flee was strong, a primal scream in my head. But the other, quieter voice, the one I hated and yet always obeyed, insisted I stay. Just a little longer. Leo, just find out. The days that followed were a waking nightmare of observation. Peggy's rituals escalated. The incense burned almost constantly, a thin, acrid plume that clung to the air. Her whispered chants grew louder, no longer conspiratorial mumbles, but a soft, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. It was hypnotic, a low, unsettling drone that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I found myself listening, trying to decipher the cadence, the meaning, but it was just a string of guttural, incomprehensible sounds, repeated endlessly. The doll on her desk underwent its own horrifying transformation. Each morning, it seemed smaller, more desiccated, its waist impossibly thin, a grotesque miniature of the human form. The rubber bands, once merely tight, now seemed to sink into the fabric, compressing it further, as if squeezing out the last vestiges of life. It looked like something that had been mummified, slowly, painfully, in plain sight. And Peggy, her physical transformation was undeniable, but it was horrifying rather than triumphant. She moved with a strange, almost manic energy, a gaunt confidence that seemed alien to her former, jovial self. Her face was sharper, her arms slender, her once bulging stomach now flat, almost concave. But her skin had taken on that disturbing, translucent quality, like stretched parchment, and dark, bruised circles shadowed her eyes. She looked less like someone who had lost weight and more like someone who had been drained, hollowed out, consumed from within. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands, a flicker of pain in her eyes, quickly masked by that brittle, triumphant giggle. By Friday, the office was buzzing with an unsettling mix of awe and discomfort. Peggy's latest weigh-in was the final, undeniable proof of something profoundly wrong. 31 pounds in just 2 weeks. It defied not just biology, but the very fabric of reality. "This can't be healthy," Kim whispered to me, her voice a thin thread of fear. We watched Peggy, a ghost of her former self, munching on a donut, still eating, while scrolling through her phone, a faint, unsettling hum emanating from her cubicle. She's eating like she's preparing for hibernation and still losing weight. It's not healthy, I whispered back, my voice flat, devoid of the usual sarcastic edge. This was too real, too close to the line, and I think I know why. I told her about the doll, the whispers, the incense, the metallic smell. Her eyes, already wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, grew even larger as I spoke, reflecting the sickly glow of the fluorescent lights. "That's insane," she breathed, her voice wavering, tinged with a horror I knew all too well. "You really think she's cursed or something?" I looked at the shriveled doll on Peggy's desk, at Peggy's translucent skin, at the hum that still vibrated in my teeth. "I don't know," I admitted, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I did know. I knew the scent of it. I knew the feel of it. It was the same old song, just a different, more mundane stage. But I'm going to find out. My hand went to my watch, tracing the cool metal. A nervous tick, yes, but also a promise. To myself. To the thing that kept pulling me into these nightmares. And perhaps, to the ghost of the man I used to be. The kind of man who might have just walked away. But that man was long gone, burned away in a forgotten fire. And all that was left was Leo Vance, the weary wanderer, perpetually drawn to the darkness, unable to look away. This was just another layer on the trauma, another notch on the long, dark road. The guttural shriek tore through the thin canvas of the tent, followed by a wet, sickening thud. My blood ran cold, a familiar, unwelcome chill that bypassed the layers of flannel and denim and settled deep in my bones. Buster, my scruffy German shepherd mix, let out a terrified whimper, pressing himself against my side, his body a rigid line of muscle and fear. Another scream, this one cut short, strangled, choked off by something massive and unspeakably hungry. Then, the heavy, squelching sound of something being dragged through the damp earth, fading into the oppressive silence of the howling woods. I tasted copper, the metallic tang of pure adrenaline, and knew with a grim certainty that whatever had just happened to my neighbors was about to happen to me. My fingers, slick with sweat, instinctively went to the cold steel of the old analog wristwatch on my left wrist, as if its unmoving hands could somehow halt the relentless march of horror. The whole damn thing had started, as it always did, with a wrong turn, a false promise of quiet. I'd been running on fumes, both literal and metaphorical, after a grueling stretch driving a refrigerated truck across the Dakotas. The hum of the engine, the endless ribbon of highway, it was a kind of white noise, a numbing drone that kept the real noise, the screaming memories, at bay. But even I needed to pull over sometimes. Even I needed a few hours where the only thing demanding my attention was the chirping of crickets or the distant call of an owl. That's what I'd told myself when I pulled off the interstate near Bozeman, aiming for some anonymous patch of dirt, a place where a man and his dog could just exist. My worn leather jacket felt heavier than usual, a familiar comfort and a constant burden. It had seen more miles, more grim sights than most people saw in a lifetime. I'd planned to hit a campground near Earthquake Lake, had even booked it online. A rare moment of optimism, maybe a week. I'd thought, just me and Buster, a little fishing, a lot of nothing. Simple, peaceful. The universe, in its infinite sadistic wisdom, seemed to find these fleeting moments of hope hilarious. "Double booked, sir," the elderly camp host at Earthquake Lake had said, her voice dripping with an apology that felt, to my cynical ears, like a practiced lie. I'd seen too many polite faces hide ugly truths. "Computer glitch, but we can send you to Howling Woods, just 10 minutes up the road. Rustic, but available." Rustic. Right. My gut. A loyal companion honed by years of avoiding trouble that always seemed to find me anyway. Immediately clenched. Rustic usually meant forgotten, and forgotten often meant best left that way. But the exhaustion was a physical weight, pressing down on my eyelids, blurring my vision. Buster, sensing my agitation, nudged my hand with his wet nose, a silent plea for stability. "Fine," I'd grunted, taking the hastily scrawled directions and the refund. No options, no choice. That was the story of my life. The drive to Howling Woods was exactly 10 minutes, as promised, but it felt like a descent into something else entirely. The asphalt quickly gave way to a dirt track, rutted and overgrown, flanked by towering lodgepole pines so dense they seemed to blot out the afternoon sun. A perpetual twilight clung to the air, thick and cloying, smelling of pine needles, damp earth, and something else, something vaguely metallic, like old blood or ozone just before a storm. A faint mist, too thick for the season, swirled between the trunks, clinging to the branches like ghostly tinsel. This wasn't rustic, it was ancient. It felt like the forest itself was exhaling, a slow, heavy breath that tasted of forgotten horrors. This wasn't just a place, it was a maw, open and waiting. My hand instinctively went to my wristwatch, not to check the time, but as a grounding tick, a small, tangible anchor in a world that increasingly refused to make sense. The campground itself consisted of a few sparsely spread out clearings, each with a rusted fire pit and a decaying picnic table. No other campers were in sight, which should have been a red flag the size of Montana, but my fatigue had dulled my instincts to a dangerous degree. The host's RV, a faded, moss-covered relic, sat perched near the entrance like a spider in its web. I approached, Buster trotting warily at my heels, his usual boundless energy replaced by a cautious silence. His ears, usually perked, were slightly lowered, twitching, scanning, picking up on frequencies I couldn't. I envied his honest fear. Mine was a dull, resigned ache. I knocked. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman, her face a roadmap of deep, weathered lines, her eyes dark, sunken pools that seemed to reflect the dim light with an unsettling inner glow. She offered a toothless smile that didn't reach her eyes, and a faint, smoky, almost animalistic scent clung to her, a scent that prickled the hairs on my arms. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a strange, gravelly cadence, almost a croon, like wind through dry reeds. "Welcome to Howling Wood," she rasped, her eyes locking onto mine. A gaze that felt less like looking at me and more like looking through me, peeling back layers, dissecting my very soul. It dragged me back to that impossible farm, to the eyes of those things that harvested souls, the same vacant, all-knowing emptiness. "You're the late arrival. Ethan, isn't it?" My real name, Leo Vance, never left my lips. "Leo," I corrected, a lie born of habit and necessity. "And this is Buster." I gestured to the dog, who was now subtly pressing against my leg, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Leo," she repeated, the name sounding foreign and heavy on her tongue. Her hand shot out, bony fingers surprisingly strong, clamping onto my wrist, right over my watch. Her grip was cold, like river stone. "You follow the rules. Leo, these rules are not suggestions." She thrust a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper into my hand. The cursive script was uneven, almost frantic, as if written by a shaking hand in a terrible hurry. It smelled of smoke, old paper, and something metallic. Each line felt less like a guideline and more like a binding incantation. "Extinguish all fires at dusk. Do not leave your tent after dark. Avoid using light sources if you must step outside. Ignore any noises. Never discuss what you see or hear. Break them," she hissed, her voice dropping to a guttural growl that vibrated in my chest, a low thrumming that echoed some primal fear. Her eyes, those dark, bottomless pits, seemed to glow brighter, reflecting the encroaching shadows. "And you may not live to regret it." Her words carried a finality that made the air around us crackle. This wasn't a warning, it was a sentence. It reminded me of the whispered truths of the man in the walls, truths that unraveled reality, or the chilling logic of Olivia, who saw people as merely raw materials. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. I managed a curt nod, the exhaustion warring with a sudden, potent surge of dread. My fingers were still wrapped around the watch, the cold metal a small comfort. It was a nervous tick, a way to anchor myself to something real, measurable, when everything else slid into the surreal. Buster let out another low growl, a rumble that deepened as the woman's eyes lingered on him for a moment, a glint of something I couldn't quite decipher in their depths, a flicker of possessiveness or just hunger. I didn't want to know. I retreated, practically dragging Buster to the campsite she'd pointed out. As I set about pitching the tent, the air grew heavier, the silence more profound. It wasn't just a lack of sound, it was an active absence, a vacuum that pressed in on my eardrums. The trees leaned closer, their branches swaying in a breeze that didn't exist. Buster, usually chasing squirrels or sniffing every new scent, kept to my heels, his head low, his tail tucked, casting nervous glances into the dense, silent forest. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. I worked quickly, my hands moving with practiced efficiency, but my mind was a churning eddy of dread. The rules: extinguish fires at dusk, don't leave the tent, no lights, ignore noises, never discuss. Each one hammered home a single, terrifying truth. Whatever was out here, it didn't like fire, it didn't like light, and it didn't want to be acknowledged. This wasn't some campfire ghost story. This felt like a pact, a concession. It felt like living under the gaze of something ancient, something that tolerated human presence only on its own monstrous terms. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a lurid smear of orange and purple that felt more like a bruise than a sunset, I was already inside the tent, every zipper secured, every flap tied down. I double-checked the padlock the host had insisted on selling me, a heavy, clunky thing that felt useless against whatever had carved those rules into her weathered face. Buster was curled up tight against my sleeping bag, his body trembling faintly. I tried to tell myself it was just the cold, but the temperature inside the tent was surprisingly mild. This was pure, unadulterated fear. The first night, the silence was worse than any noise. It was a living thing, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on me, amplifying every creak of the tent fabric, every thump of my own frantic heartbeat. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear something, anything, beyond the blood pounding in my ears. Buster shifted, whining softly, and then a low, sustained growl rumbled deep in his chest. It was a warning, a sound I hadn't heard from him since that cursed farm, since the things in the field had turned their empty eyes on me. Then came the howling. It wasn't wolves. It wasn't coyotes. This was something else entirely. It was guttural, mournful, layered, like multiple voices tangled in a dirge, each note striking a primal chord of fear. It started distant, a low, keening wail that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Then it drew closer, circling the camp, growing louder, more insistent, more desperate. It wasn't just sound, it was a physical pressure, vibrating through the thin tent walls, through my bones, shaking me to my core. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated suffering, and something else, a hunger that made my stomach churn. Buster whimpered again, burying his head against my chest, trembling uncontrollably. His fur, usually soft, felt bristly, charged with static electricity. I wrapped my arms around him, clutching him tight, trying to offer comfort I didn't possess. My hand automatically went to my old wristwatch, my thumb tracing the cold metal bezel. My mind screamed at me to grab my mag light, to shine it out there, to confront whatever beast was making those sounds. But the host's words, "Do not use light sources," echoed in my head. And those eyes, those terrible, knowing eyes. I lay awake, clutching the small, heavy pistol I kept in my go bag, its cold grip a small, futile comfort against a terror that felt ancient and unknowable. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to pack up, to drive away into the blessed anonymity of the highway. But where would I go? Running had never worked before. The things that found me didn't care about state lines or speed limits. They cared about what I was, what I'd survived, what I attracted. Besides, the image of Buster, shivering against me, was a lead weight in my gut. I couldn't just abandon him to whatever lurked outside. My reluctant conscience, that cursed fatal flaw, kept me rooted, paralyzed by a responsibility I hated. The howling continued, receding and advancing, a horrifying symphony that seemed to mock my flimsy shelter. It was louder than the screams from that bus, more guttural than the growls from the man in the walls, and more despairing than anything I'd heard since the impossible whispers on that snow-choked mountain pass. It felt like it was trying to dig its way into my brain, to unearth old terrors, to prove that I was truly, irrevocably broken. Finally, agonizingly, the first slivers of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, then a pale, hopeful gray. The howling faded, replaced by a lingering, oppressive silence. I breathed, a ragged, shaky exhale that felt like I was expelling all the fear I'd held in for hours. Buster stirred, lifting his head, whimpering softly. He looked as exhausted as I felt. The next day, I ventured out, Buster sticking to my heels like a shadow, his ears perked, his entire body tense. The forest, bathed in the pale morning light, seemed almost normal, beautiful even, with the river meandering through the dense pines, the jagged mountain peaks looming in the distance. But the beauty felt like a deception, a thin veneer over something fundamentally wrong. My survivor's gaze, honed by years of living with the abnormal, picked out details, an unnatural stillness in the air, a faint, metallic tang on the breeze, the absolute absence of small forest sounds. No bird song, no scurrying critters, nothing. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I spent the day exploring, half-heartedly trying to find a rational explanation for the sounds of the night, but my mind kept returning to the host's eyes, her voice, those impossible rules. This wasn't a bear or a wolf pack. This was something else, something that demanded ritual obedience. This was a different kind of horror, a primal, territorial one. I checked my wristwatch again, its ticking a slow, steady pulse against the frantic beat of my heart. Time wasn't just passing, it was being consumed. As dusk approached, a new, heavy dread settled over the camp. The air grew colder, and that faint, unnatural mist began to creep through the trees, swirling at the edges of my clearing like conscious entities. I worked quickly, mechanically, extinguishing the small fire I'd dared to light, securing all my belongings in the bear box, double-checking the tent locks. Every instinct screamed to flee, but I was rooted by that damn conscience, that nagging feeling that running only prolonged the inevitable. And Buster, his unwavering loyalty was both my greatest strength and my most vulnerable weakness. I would not leave him. Back inside the tent, the darkness pressed in, deeper than any night I'd ever known. Buster was already trembling, whimpering softly. My hand went to his fur, stroking it, trying to soothe him, knowing it was futile. The seconds bled into minutes, the minutes into an eternity. My wristwatch felt heavy on my wrist, a constant reminder of the relentless crawl of time. Then, the howling began again, closer this time, accompanied by something infinitely more sinister. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. They weren't shuffling, they were planting, impactful, squelching sounds, as if something impossibly massive was dragging itself through the damp undergrowth, circling my tent. Each step vibrated through the ground, through the thin sleeping pad, directly into my chest. This wasn't a search. It was a patrol, a hunting circle, a low, resonant growl, more a rumble than a sound, vibrated through the air, chilling me to the bone. It was not animalistic in the way a bear's growl is. It was deeper, older, filled with an ancient malevolence that felt older than the mountains themselves. It spoke of hunger, of territory, of things that shouldn't exist. It was the sound that had echoed in my mind after that encounter with the mirror doppelganger, a sound that spoke of something inhuman trying to imitate sentience, trying to force its way into our reality. I held Buster close, his body rigid with terror, his fur bristling against my arm, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate drum. The footsteps paused just outside my tent entrance. I could feel the presence, a vast looming shadow against the thin fabric. The air grew impossibly cold, stealing the breath from my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, repeating the host's mantra in my head. Ignore any noises. Do not leave your tent. Do not use light. My hands gripped the pistol, but I knew, with a certainty born of bitter experience, that a few rounds of hollow points wouldn't mean a damn thing against whatever was out there. This was a different kind of monster. This was the kind that cared about rules. Then, a deep, raspy exhale, a sound like dry leaves scraping against rock, directly outside the tent. It was cold, bone deep, and I could almost smell its fetid breath through the canvas. It paused, a pregnant silence stretching into an eternity. Every nerve ending screamed at me to open my eyes, to look, to confirm the horror. But the host's voice, a chilling echo in my mind, repeated, never discuss what you see or hear. Looking was seeing. Seeing was knowing. And knowing in this place meant death. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps resumed, circling, then slowly, agonizingly, receding into the oppressive stillness of the night. The guttural hum began to vibrate through the air again, a low, distant tolling, like a funeral bell for the unsuspecting. I lay there, clutching Buster, tears stinging my eyes, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of my helplessness. This was worse than Ethan, the charming cannibal. Worse than Mitch, the imposter who'd taken over my friend's skin. Here, I was caged, exposed, and utterly, profoundly alone. Then came the yelps, not Buster's. From the next campsite over, a dog's panicked, desperate cries, followed by silence, a chilling, absolute silence. Then, human voices, distant, desperate, pleading. A woman's high-pitched scream, suddenly cut short. A man's guttural cry, choked off. Silence again. Total, complete, deafening silence. My blood turned to ice. Buster whimpered, burying his head deeper against my chest. He knew. We both knew. Whatever had been circling, whatever had exhaled outside my tent, had moved on. It had chosen a different prey. And now, there was nothing, just the vast black emptiness of the night, punctuated by the faint, distant echo of that mournful, guttural howl, carrying on the wind, a chilling testament to the unseen, unholy feast. The following hours were a disorienting blur of fear, a torturous eternity of dread and helplessness. The howling returned in waves, interspersed with those guttural growls and the unmistakable sounds of heavy movement, branches snapping under immense weight, leaves rustling as something dragged itself through the undergrowth, deep, labored breathing just outside the flimsy canvas. My mind raced with questions, each more terrifying than the last. What was out there? How close was it now? Could the thin fabric of the tent truly keep us safe? Or was it just a matter of time before it decided my camp was next? I clutched Buster tighter, feeling his trembling body against mine, his fear an almost physical extension of my own. Every creak of the trees, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified, each sound a tiny blade stabbing through the fragile veil of safety. I whispered to myself. Just make it until dawn. Over and over, clinging to the thought like a lifeline. It was a mantra, a desperate plea to a hostile universe. Buster pressed against me, whimpering softly, his nose tucked into my armpit. I whispered reassurances, but my own voice shook, a pathetic attempt at calm. This was the kind of terror that made a man pray for unconsciousness, for oblivion. It was the kind of terror that reminded me of the impossible farm, of the true cosmic indifference that lay beyond the veil of life and death. There was no escape, not even in my deepest fear. When dawn finally broke, it brought with it a cold, stark light that revealed a grim scene. My muscles ached, my eyes burned, and my heart felt like a shriveled, bruised thing in my chest. I cautiously unzipped the tent, Buster still glued to my side, sniffing the air nervously. The neighboring campsite was a scene from a nightmare. Blood was smeared across the picnic table, glistening wetly in the morning light. Tuft after tuft of dark fur, clearly not a dog's, was matted into the damp earth, clinging to pine needles and blades of grass. A single, muddy boot lay discarded near the extinguished fire pit. The neighboring RV was abandoned, its door swinging eerily on its hinges, a silent, gaping maw. There was no sign of the family, no sign of their dog. Only the blood in the fur and the overwhelming, lingering scent of something metallic and foul. The host's cryptic warning replayed in my head, a chilling echo. This place is ancient, not meant for our kind. I looked at Buster, his brown eyes wide and fearful, then back at the evidence of unspeakable horror. This wasn't just a place, it was a trap, baited with solitude and peace. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. Every movement was efficient, driven by a primal need to flee, to put as many miles between myself and that place as humanly possible. My go bag was already packed. Of course, always packed. The tent was crammed into its sack, the sleeping bags rolled tight. Buster, sensing the urgency, didn't need to be told twice to jump into the truck. As I sped down the rutted dirt track, leaving the suffocating shadows of the lodgepole pines behind, a sheriff's patrol car was pulling up, its emergency lights already flashing. I pulled over, my heart hammering. The deputy, a young kid with eyes too innocent for the job, eyed me with suspicion. "You were camping here?" he asked, his gaze lingering on my worn leather jacket, then on the heavily packed bed of my truck. "Just leaving," I said, my voice hoarse. I kept my face blank, my answers short. Slept through the night, heard a few weird howls, but nothing unusual. Thought it was just coyotes. It was a practiced lie, honed over years of dealing with authorities who either couldn't understand or simply refused to believe the kind of things that haunted my reality. He eyed me, clearly unconvinced, but there was nothing to hold me for. I was just another transient, passing through. He mumbled something about checking on the other campers. I just nodded, feigning ignorance, my gaze drifting to my wristwatch, its second hand ticking away the escape. As I drove away, the winding mountain roads unspooling before me, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The host stood at the entrance to Howling Woods, a tiny, dark figure framed by the menacing trees. Her eyes, even from that distance, seemed to bore into mine. And then, I saw her lips move, mouthing 4 words that sent a fresh wave of ice down my spine, words that echoed with the weight of ancient, unspeakable knowledge. Follow the rules. Always. I never camped overnight again. The mountains still call, a distant siren song of false peace. But their solitude now carries a menacing undertone, a faint, lingering echo of that mournful, guttural howl. It drifts through the silence, like a ghostly reminder, ensuring I never forget the rules of the Howling Woods. Every snap of a twig, every distant howl, every shiver that runs through Buster at night reminds me of that place, of the things that exist just beyond the veil of human understanding. things that demand obedience and feed on fear. Some places are better left undiscovered. Some rules are etched not in ink, but in blood and bone. On the darkest nights, when the world feels silent and still, I swear I feel the presence of those ancient woods pressing against my mind, whispering their secrets in a language I'll never understand. It's as though the howling woods have marked me, their eerie song lingering in my bones, a haunting melody I'll carry to my grave. Another layer added to the trauma that defines me, a testament to the cursed life of Leo Vance. Total characters, 9,788. The slick sheen of the old, laminated contract mocked me, each word a splinter driven deeper into my already tattered psyche. My name, emblazoned there in a crude, almost childlike font, seemed to vibrate with a silent scream. Jerry Brown to be dropped at restaurant back door by 8 a.m. $75,000 cash will be dropped at your residence by noon of the same day. The letters swam, then solidified, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of my childhood, into the twisted memory of a man I had called father. The stench of dust and decay in this forgotten corner of the house suddenly clung to my throat like a shroud, and I crumpled, the flimsy paper a lead weight in my trembling hand. The world tilted, the air tasting of metal and betrayal, and all I could hear was the frantic, desperate thrumming of my own blood in my ears, a symphony of a life unraveled by a horror far older and more intimate than any roadside ghost. The right to my old worn leather jacket was slung over the back of a hardback chair, just like it always was. Even in this stagnant, unloved house, I was in Dingwall of all places, a forgotten speck on the map of my restless life, trying to make sense of what was left behind. My father's house. He'd finally kicked the bucket, not with a bang, but with a wheeze and a terminal diagnosis that even his gambling addiction couldn't cheat. I wasn't here for closure. That was a fool's errand. I was here because someone had to be, to tie up the loose ends before the bank moved in. My reluctant conscience, as I often cursed it, had dragged me back, just as it always seemed to drag me into every goddamn mess. I checked my analog wristwatch, 3:17 p.m. The hands moved, uncaring, a constant in a world of variables. The place smelled of stale tobacco, dust, and something indefinably old, like forgotten grief. I'd been working through boxes in the attic, each one a Pandora's box of faded photographs, brittle letters, and the detritus of a life lived largely in shadows. It was a chore, a grim penance for a past I barely remembered, or perhaps, subconsciously, didn't want to. My own childhood here was a blur, fragmented by the kind of gaps trauma etches into the mind. I remembered the house, yes, but the people who lived in it, my family, they were more like characters in a half-forgotten story, always just out of focus. My father had always been a distant figure, his life a chaotic dance between his two obsessions. Ross County F.C. and the insatiable maw of his gambling addiction. There were always arguments, hushed whispers behind closed doors, the frantic clatter of coins. And then there was Mickey, my older brother, gone, swallowed by the earth in 1996, when I was just a 4-year-old tag-along. 11 years old, Mickey had been a face in faded photographs, a name whispered with a quiet, lingering sadness. The police searched, the community mourned, but nothing, just a void. I remembered the hysterical grief of my mother, a raw, primal scream that seemed to echo in the very fabric of this house. And then, 2 years later, 1998, she too was gone. A car accident, faulty seatbelt, the official report had claimed, ejecting her from the vehicle. I remembered my teacher, a kind but grim-faced woman, driving me to the hospital, the sterile smell, the quiet pronouncement. My father survived, of course, lucky him, or perhaps unlucky me. I picked up another box, this one heavier than the others, tucked away in the deepest recess of a dusty wardrobe. It wasn't labeled, just taped shut with industrial-grade packing tape, as if its contents were meant to be forgotten. Buried, my fingers calloused from years of hauling freight and stacking crates. Fumbled with the tape. A cloud of fine gray dust puffed into the air as the lid creaked open. Inside, it wasn't the usual collection of old newspapers or sentimental trinkets. This was different. This box hummed with a low, disquieting energy, a whisper of secrets that had been gathering dust for decades. Bank letters, repossession notices, bankruptcy documents, a grim litany of financial ruin, the kind of stuff I'd half expected. My father was a gambler, after all. But then, beneath the usual paperwork, I saw them. Letters of correspondence from an insurance agency. My mother's accident, investigation reports, statements. My breath hitched. I usually avoided anything connected to that period, a self-preservation instinct honed by years of running from things that defy easy explanation, but the relentless pull of my reluctant conscience wouldn't let me look away. I pulled out a thick sheaf of papers, the edges yellowed and brittle. The report confirmed the faulty seatbelt, the ejection. But then, my eyes snagged on a paragraph, a detail I'd never known, never been told. Mr. Brown, you have opted for a lump sum payment of $125,000, 125,000 pounds. The number hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My father, living in a house that always felt like it was crumbling around us, always struggling, always chasing the next bet. He had come into that kind of money, and where the hell had it gone? My cynical mind immediately supplied the answer. The track, the bookies, the dark, hungry maw of his addiction. But even as the thought formed, a cold, wet tendril of dread began to coil in my gut. This felt wrong, too big, too quiet. My fingers, almost of their own volition, delved deeper into the box. Beneath the insurance papers, tucked away in a manila folder, was a single grainy photocopy, a handwritten contract. The paper was creased, blurred in places, as if it had been folded and unfolded countless times, its secrets both guarded and examined. It was dated 1996, the year Mickey disappeared. My heart began to beat an erratic drum against my ribs. I squinted, trying to make out the faded ink. It spoke of dealings, meeting places, times for transportation of goods. The words seemed innocuous enough, on the surface, but the context, the date, the general air of clandestine secrecy, it set off every alarm bell in my head. Years of dealing with the abnormal, with the things that slithered in the unseen corners of the world, had taught me to trust that gnawing feeling of wrongness. Then, the final line, stark and horrifyingly clear. Michael Brown to be dropped off at the restaurant back door at 7 a.m. $50,000 cash will be dropped off at your residence by midday on the same day in a brown leather single-strap bag. My breath caught in my throat. Michael Brown, Mickey, dropped off at a restaurant for 50,000 pounds. The words pulsed on the page, a grotesque accusation. What restaurant? My eyes darted to the top of the page, where a partial logo, mostly cut off, was visible. McDimples, the name, half remembered from childhood, slammed into me with the force of a concrete block. McDimples, the cheap, garish fast food joint where my father used to take me after Ross County matches. The place he'd taken Mickey, too. The place with the creepy mascot, Reggie McDimple, a clown with unsettlingly large dimples and a voice like nails on a chalkboard. My mind, usually a fortress of cynicism, felt suddenly vulnerable, exposed. I vaguely remembered it, a brightly lit, slightly grimy oasis in the damp Scottish evenings. A blatant McDonald's ripoff. Even I, as a child, had registered that. The big stack, the whooper, knockoffs of knockoffs, and the smile meal, for kids with its broken or used toys. I remembered the zombified teenagers behind the counter, punching orders into archaic machines, sliding food through a greasy hatch, always super fast service, always suspicious. My observational skills, even then, were already kicking in, registering the pervasive oddness, the slight wrongness in the air that others seemed to ignore. And Reggie, God, Reggie, the memory of him sent a shiver down my spine, a ghost of childhood unease. He'd prance around, red and black tattered clothes, a grotesque china doll face with those two huge, unsettling dimples. His voice, a funny, affected American accent. His shrill, annoying laugh when someone lost a game. "Oh, shucks, better luck next time," he'd cackle, twisting his fingers in those dimples, his loose jaw flapping. I'd lost a lot of those games. My father, usually so aloof, would encourage me, even push me to play. I was shy, uncoordinated. I'd seen the flicker of disappointment in his eyes when I inevitably fumbled, failed, lost. I'd always attributed it to a father's natural desire for his kid to win, to try new things. A small, pathetic ambition on his part. But now, the context shifted. The image of his disappointment transformed into something monstrous, something unspeakable. I remembered the staff. They always looked vacant, drugged, perhaps. My cynical adult mind could see it clearly now. The hollow eyes, the slow movements, the way they seemed to exist in a perpetual haze. As a kid, I'd asked my dad why they were always tired. He just grunted, waved me off. Another detail that clicked into place. Another piece of the macabre mosaic. McDimples had closed suddenly. I remembered that too. The day before it closed was the only time I'd ever won one of Reggie's games. My father, for once, had been genuinely excited, beaming, talking about the McDimples factory tour we'd won for the next day. I remembered his crushed face, the almost palpable sense of devastation. When we arrived the next morning to find the building boarded up, desolate, I'd been confused then, a child unable to grasp the magnitude of an adult's disappointment over a silly fast food joint. It's just a restaurant, I'd thought, but he'd spent a lot of time there with Mickey. Now, I knew why. My fingers scrambled, rummaging through the box, a growing nausea churning in my gut. Newspaper clippings, dozens of them, all about Mickey's disappearance, the community efforts, the dead ends, and then the new ones, McDimples headed letters, dates 1997, 1999, 2000, and then 2002. Another photocopied contract, the same details, meeting places, transportation, and the crucial detail that now, having seen Mickey's name, solidified the horror into an unshakable, agonizing truth. My name, Jerry Brown, to be dropped at restaurant back door by 8 a.m. $75,000 cash will be dropped at your residence by noon of the same day. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, clammy sweat breaking out on my forehead. My body felt heavy, rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force was pinning me down. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an amputation, a severing of any remaining threads of innocence, of any belief in the fundamental good of my own kin. It was the ultimate betrayal, delivered 2 decades too late. Beneath that contract, more newspaper clippings. Recent ones. The Rossshire Journal, local fast food restaurant McDimples has been raided in the early hours of this morning. My eyes darted across the text, skimming, searching for confirmation, for a way to deny this unspeakable reality. Evidence of child trafficking has led police to popular fast food restaurant McDimples, which has now been under surveillance for several months. The words blurred, then sharpened, each one a shard of glass in my mind. Trafficking. Children. McDimples. My brother. Me. I grabbed another clipping, my hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. McDimples trafficking scandal. McDimple's owner disappears after link to child trafficking discovered. Police raid McDimple's restaurant linked to trafficking children. The headlines screamed, echoes of a horror I had somehow, miraculously, escaped. I pulled out the last one, the most recent, the one that spelled out the full, agonizing truth. An ex-employee, anonymous, recounting the horror. Reggie McDimple, not his real name, keeping staff drugged, dependent, unspeakable beatings and torture if they ever stepped out of line. And then, the part that turned my stomach inside out, twisting it into a knot of sick, burning rage. She went on to say how Reggie McDimple would have scores of struggling parents come to his restaurant, ready and willing to offer their children for thousands of pounds. They would organize games for the kids where the winner would then be taken to be sold and the parents given large sums of money. My father, my own father, the man who taught me to kick a football, who'd sit beside me at freezing matches, bundled in scarves, his face ruddy with the cold, the man I'd tried to rationalize, to understand, to forgive for his flaws. He wasn't just a gambler, he was a monster. He had sold Mickey. He had planned to sell me. The games, his disappointment when I lost, the ecstatic joy when I won that one time, the factory tour he was so eager for. It wasn't about a prize. It was about the drop-off. It was about the money. He wasn't disappointed in my losing the game. He was disappointed I hadn't won my way into a child trafficking ring. The very thought, raw and visceral, made bile rise in my throat. And my mother, her death, the faulty seatbelt. My father had survived. Had he done it? Had he unclipped her belt, ensuring her death, to collect that life insurance payout, to fuel his addiction? The thought was a searing brand on my soul, hotter than any fire I'd ever fled. It was the ultimate grotesque irony. I had grown up believing I was cursed, a magnet for the macabre, always running from an indistinct, burning horror in my past. But the deepest, most personal horror had been right there, in my own home, in the hands of my own flesh and blood. The owner of the restaurant had gone on the run, unlocated, no justice, just this chilling, tangible proof, tucked away in a dusty box, waiting for me to find it. My father had died, taking his secrets with him, but leaving behind a paper trail designed to shatter any remaining illusion of peace or normalcy I might have clung to. I stood there, swaying, the world around me silent, save for the frantic beat of my heart. The worn leather of my jacket felt heavy on my shoulders, a familiar comfort now imbued with the weight of this new, profound betrayal. My hand, instinctively, went to my analog wristwatch, tracing the cool metal, not for the time, just for the grounding, for the fragile hope that a simple, mechanical certainty might anchor me in a world that had just proven itself infinitely more monstrous than I'd ever dared to imagine. The past wasn't just a vague, burning memory I ran from. It was a live wire, sparking and crackling, ready to electrocute me with every new, horrifying revelation. I picked up the go bag I always kept packed, its familiar weight a reassurance. This place, this house, this town, they were poisoned now. There was nothing for me here but the ghosts of a monstrous past. I had to move. I always had to move, because the monsters didn't just hide in the shadows of desolate highways or abandoned buildings. Sometimes, they wore the faces of the people you called family. And that, I realized with a chilling certainty, was the most terrifying horror of all. Character count 923.